He was a remarkable personality. Whenever I went out with him in the street, people would stop and speak to him. Mukhtar and many of them. Mukhtar came to Egypt when he once fled from Libya to Egypt. He stayed in our house. My father's named Omar after Omar al-Mukhtar. At first, the Saudi king was reluctant because he feared that the Arab League would simply be a British vehicle. And my grandfather convinced him otherwise. From the start, the Arab League was driven by how to support the independence movements. But the real disagreement, I would say, that took place, which eventually meant that my grandfather left Egypt, was over Nasser's decision to enter and fight in Yemen. And in fact, Malcolm X had told my father that he would be killed.
أهلا بيكم في حلقة جديدة من 7000. النهاردة حلقتنا من لندن ومعانا دكتور عبد الرحمن عزام. عبد الرحمن حصل على الدكتوراه من جامعة أكسفورد في تاريخ العالم الإسلامي، والنهاردة هنتكلم معاه على تاريخ صلاح الدين والدولة الأيوبية ونهاية الدولة الفاطمية في مصر. المرحلة دي كانت من أكتر المراحل المهمة في تاريخ مصر، لأن حصل فيها نقلة من الحكم الشيعي الإسماعيلي للحكم السني، وكان على طول في كلام حوالين طبيعة الشعب المصري ساعتها واتجاهاته الدينية، ودي حاجة من الحاجات اللي هنحاول نفهمها النهاردة ونفهم المرحلة دي عدت على مصر ازاي من الناحية السياسية ومن الناحية الاجتماعية ومن الناحية الاقتصادية. المرحلة دي كانت مرحلة فيها توترات شديدة وتوترات كتير جدا بسبب وجود الممالك الصليبية، وده كان ليه تأثير كبير على مصر بسبب وجود الدولة الزنكية اللي كانت موجودة في بلاد الشام في ذلك الوقت، والدولة الفاطمية اللي كانت ضعيفة جدا وفي طريقها للانهيار مع وجود الخلافة العباسية. ازاي العوامل دي كلها حوالين مصر أثرت على الحياة في مصر، أثرت على الناس، أثرت على السياسة، ازاي انهارت الدولة الفاطمية، وكيف تمكن صلاح الدين من وصول حكم مصر في المرحلة الدقيقة دي من تاريخ الوطن. عبد الرحمن نشأ في أسرة عريقة من أسر المصرية، بينحدروا من قرية اسمها قرية الشبك، ولكن جده اللي متسمي على اسمه عبد الرحمن عزام هو أول أمين عام لجامعة الدول العربية. ولكن في كتير من القصص حوالين عبد الرحمن عزام الجد، لأن بدايته ما كانتش مع جامعة الدول العربية، بدايته كانت قبل كده بكتير في السياسة وفي النضال ضد الاستعمار. وعبد الرحمن هيحكي لنا شوية النهاردة عن تاريخ جده كذلك. الحوار النهاردة باللغة الإنجليزية، لأنه عبد الرحمن عاش معظم حياته برا مصر، وهو بيفضل أنه يتكلم باللغة الإنجليزية عشان يكون أكثر طلاقة وأكثر تعبيرا عن نفسه. أهلا عبد الرحمن.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you with us today. And let's start with the family. You come from a family that was obviously entrenched in politics for a very long time. And I think you still remember a lot of stories about your grandfather. So it would be great that you tell us some of the stories about your grandfather, especially during his time with Saad Zarul. And after that, and before that, during his time in Libya with Omar al-Mukhtar.
Sure.
And definitely would want to know how, if that had any impact on your choices later on in politics and in your studies. So let's start with Abdurrahman Azam, the grandfather, and what he meant to you and what you remember from his stories and what you remember from his time in Egypt.
I was very lucky to have met my grandfather and spent years with my grandfather. I was about 12 or 13 years old when he passed away in the 70s, mid-70s. And at that time we were living in Beirut. He lived with us in Lebanon. My father was working in Lebanon. He had an architectural practice in Beirut, and I grew up in Beirut in the 60s and the mid-70s. And my grandfather was living with us. He would have been in his 70s by then, so his days of politics had long passed, but he was a remarkable personality. Whenever I went out with him in the street, people would stop and speak to him. As a child, as a kid, you don't quite recognize how people viewed somebody who's older, because everybody who's old is just old. I remember people coming to our house and greeting him. And it was only later that I began to appreciate. He spoke very rarely about himself. He was this quiet man. I would say the one quality that exuded, I remember to this day, was his utter, unshakable self-confidence. He really didn't have any fear in him. You know, growing up in Beirut in the 70s, it was during the Civil War. I recall that 74, 75, the Civil War was quite intense. It was a very traumatic period. And my grandfather was living with us. And all I can remember was his utter lack of fear, lack of emotion. He was completely calm. He was almost detached from it. And as a young boy who was scared because of the fighting on the streets, I remember the snipers and the fighting and the bloodshed. That's the one quality that stood out for me, his total calmness. It's only later, and one of my regrets is I didn't have time enough to speak to him and ask him questions, that I actually began to understand from my father about his remarkable life. He grew up in what I guess is a upper middle class family, landowning family, fallahin in the best sense of the word. And he was the first of the family around 1912, 1913 to go and study abroad. He came to London, to St. Thomas, to study medicine. But even at that time, he was into politics. It was a world dominated by the Egyptian struggle against the British rule, of course, as we know. The emergence of the British rule, the mandate over Egypt, the national, the Dinshawi incident and so forth, and all the kind of uproar that was taking place around the, anti-British nationalist movements that, of course, culminated in Saad Zaghloul and the Wafd Party. My grandfather only studied 1 year in London because at that time, around I'm not very good with dates, around 1914, 1915,
yes,
or 1912, 13 maybe.
The Great War.
The First World War started. No, I was talking about the Balkans War, which started maybe a year or two before or after. I can't quite recall. This is where certain Balkan states rose up against the Ottoman Empire. And at that time, of course, there was a great feeling of pan-Ottoman, pan-Islamic fervor. And my grandfather dropped his studies and traveled across Europe to fight with the Turks against the Balkan states. Following which he returned to Egypt. This was during the war, so that'd be 1915 or so. And he realized at that time that the British were keeping Egyptian nationalists under very close surveillance. And so he did quite a remarkable thing. He would have been I think he was born in 1893, so he would have been 21, 22 years old. He decided to escape and go to Libya. And for 7 years, he remained and fought with the Libyan nationalist movements, initially against the British, in what is known as Cyrenaica, which is
because at the time Libya did not exist as a nation.
There was no Libyan state at that time. There was Cyrenaica, there was Fazan, and there was Tripoli, and it was under different rulers. Of course, at that time it was under the Ottoman rule, but very soon the Ottomans were driven out. And then after the First World War ended, he remained in Libya and he moved over to Tripoli, where he fought with the Libyan nationalists against the Italian rule. The Italians, of course, had the mandate over Libya. And it was then that he met with some famous Libyan nationalists, people like Ramadan al-Suwahli, Ahmed al-Murayed, and so forth. And over the years, he developed very, very close relations with Libya. Relations which lasted for many, many, many years.
I think it is during that time that he developed that strong relationship with Omar al-Mukhtar as well.
Omar al-Mukhtar and many, many of them. Omar al-Mukhtar came to Egypt when he once fled from Libya to Egypt. He stayed in our house. My father's named Omar after Omar al-Mukhtar. He had a great affinity with him, but there were many others. And my father always had a great sense of Arabness, Arab identity. And I think it was probably born in Libya. Throughout his life, he remained very fond of Libya, and he would come back. I'll mention in a few minutes, his attachment to Libya came back later in the 1940s.
He was always associated with that wave of Arab nationalism, and he was at the very beginning of it. I think it makes sense that he became the first Secretary General of the Arab League.
Even in his 20s, when he came back to Egypt, and I think he was elected in the elections of 1922. He was in Wafd Party elections.
Was he a member of the Wafd Party at the time?
I'm not sure. I don't think he ever mentioned it. I don't think he was ever officially a member, but I'm not quite sure if he ran as an independent or as a member of the Wafd. I could be wrong. I really cannot recall. But he knew Saad Zaghloul very well. He was a young man at that time. My grandfather, he was, he would have been he was probably 30 years old. I think he needed to be 30 to be a member of parliament. He was just about 30. But even then, in the 1920s, he spoke a lot about pan-Arabism. He wrote many articles. He wrote a very famous article about Al-Arab Ummat al-Mustaqbal. He wrote many articles in which he spoke about it.
Do you remember which newspaper?
No, I cannot remember.
Okay.
But, and at that time, Egypt was not in the mood for Arab identity. Egypt was struggling with its own nationalist identity. There was a period where it flirted with the pharaonic kind of
the ancient Egyptian identity.
And even Saad Zaghloul himself had very little interest. And there's a very famous time when Saad Zaghloul told my grandfather that 0 + 0 = 0. He had very little regard for the Arabs.
And the 2 zeros that he was referring to were the
Arab unity.
Okay.
That he put two Arabs together, nothing. Of course, one has to remember that the world looked a different place. At that time, most of the Arab countries, in fact, all of them, all apart from Saudi Arabia and maybe a few others, were under mandate, under colonial rule, whether the French or British rule. And in the 1920s, the nationalist movement began to emerge. And then, my grandfather continued and persevered with this. He served in several ministries. I believe he was a minister under Ahmed Neher. He was Minister of Awqaf, and he was also Minister of the Territorial Army. And he continued in his capacity, always speaking about the Arab identity, about Pan-Arabism. But he was also part of a wave of politicians that began to emerge in this period, who were driven by a vision of what the Arab world is going to look like. And they were fiercely anti-colonial and driven by nationalistic desires and endeavors. And it was during this period in the 1930s that he came and became friends with many of these Arab nationalists who would later assume positions of great power.
Like whom?
Like in Syria, for example, Shukri Qawatli in Syria, like Jamil Mardam in Syria, like in Lebanon, Henry Farahoun, like Riyad al-Sulh, like Habib Bourguiba in Tunis. Later, my grandfather got to meet Ben Bella, that comes later. But he knew all these people, and they moved in the same orbit. And then, the Arabs began to think about a regional organization. There was a real struggle at that period of time. So we're talking about my grandfather was also instrumental in making sure that Egypt did not go into the war, did not tried to remain neutral during the war. And it was during that period where the British started to think about what this regional alliance was going to look like. And the Arab League really could have gone in two different ways. There was a real attempt for it to become an alliance under Iraq and under Jordan.
Which were during the time under the British influence.
Of course, and there was a famous politician, Nouri Saeed, in Iraq. And this would have been something, an Arab League, which was more or less controlled by the British and under their auspices indirectly. Or the Arab League could have gone in a different direction, which was a vehicle for nationalist, anti-colonial, anti-imperial. And in a way, one of the key players in all this was the way that Saudi Arabia would come in. And my grandfather was sent to Saudi Arabia, and he developed a very, very close relationship with the King of Saudi Arabia.
You said he was sent. Was it by the King Farouk at the time?
By Egyptian government, to try to convince Saudi Arabia to come into this. And at first, the Saudi king was reluctant because he feared that the Arab League would simply be a British vehicle. And my grandfather convinced him otherwise. Yusuf Yassin was another of the people around him. These were all Arab nationalists who had found refuge in Saudi Arabia and who were, fired up by this nationalistic aspirations. And one of the conditions...
Yusuf Yassin is an Egyptian.
Yusuf Yassin is originally Syrian, I believe.
Syrian, okay. Yes. But he was not mandated by the Egyptian government.
No, Yusuf Yassin is one of the people advisors for the Malik Abdelaziz,
okay.
who was part of this entourage of people who supported him. A lot of the people were not Egyptian, I must say. Mainly Syrians, Palestinians, Lebanese.
But Abdurrahman Azam was mandated by the Egyptian government
to bring Saudi Arabia into the Arab League. He convinced Malik Abdelaziz one of the conditions of that is that Azam would become the first Secretary General of the Arab League.
Okay.
And the Arab League was born in 1945. It was, I believe, it actually preceded the United Nations organization, So it was one of very large, I think it was only the second international organization after the one in Latin America. And from the start, the Arab League was driven by how to support the independence movements, whether it's in Syria and in Lebanon against the French, whether it's, of course, in Algeria against the French, in Libya, where at that point, Libya was going to be partitioned, and I'll come back to that. But also, interestingly enough, my grandfather had a vision which went beyond the Islamic world, beyond the Arab world into the Islamic world. He played an absolutely instrumental role in the independence of Indonesia in 1948, which was under Dutch rule. Now, of course, one may ask, what has Indonesia got to do with the Arab League? But he did not see it that way. He saw it as an independence, movement. And he played a vital role in cultivating relations with many of the Indonesian students who had come to the Azhar, who were then used as vehicles for nationalist movements. But more directly, he actually helped in sending weapons to Indonesia to break there was a kind of encirclement, there was a blockade that the Dutch had imposed on Indonesia. And it's all thanks to that Egypt was the very first country to recognize Indonesian independence. And in 1948, Indonesia became independent, largely thanks to the effort of the Arab League. And many, many years later, I'd say in the 90s, I remember, the Indonesian government recognized my grandfather by awarding him posthumously the highest recognition in Indonesia for his efforts. One can also say the same about Algeria. He was close to Ben Bella. Ben Bella used to come and visit us in our house. And again, he played an important role in making sure that arms and the right messaging and support for the nationalist movements. But he never forgot Libya. And Libya, in a way, was one of his greatest successes, because Libya, at the end of the Second World War, was going to be partitioned by the British, the Italians, and the French, who wanted, of course, to mandate it into the 3 different territories. And the Arabs knew the danger of that. The Arab League played an incredibly important role in, there was a UN commissioner called William Pelt who had been sent to Libya. And they played a pivotal role lobbying at the UN. And my grandfather, of course, had very strong Libyan connections, got back onto his Libyan horse and played a very important dynamic role in ensuring that Libya was not partitioned, lobbied all the UN countries, and it came down to a vote at the UN. And I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe that the vote came down to 1 or 2 votes, and the one swinging vote that actually secured Libyan independence and integrity came from, of all countries, Haiti. And I also believe that the Haiti government had ordered its UN ambassador to vote for partition and mandate, but thanks to my grandfather and to other people, managed to influence him and to see the light of day. And as a result,
so he voted against the instruction of his government's
instructions for Libyan independence. My grandfather was greatly honored in Libya. He had the key to the city of Tripoli, and he actually visited just before he passed away in the 70s, and he was feted by everyone. So he continued the nationalist struggle, and that period, which I think is an underrated period of the late 1940s, was a very strong Arab nationalist movement taking place. 48, of course, one should also mention 48, the role that the Arab League played in it, the Arab countries. And often, unfortunately, I believe, or maybe not unfortunately, that's the way the history works, one associates Arab nationalism with maybe the 1960s and Abdel Nasser and so forth. And that period of the mid-40s to the early 50s is often overlooked, or is often seen as a precursor to the Arab nationalist movement, which was certainly a more populist movement, but I would argue was clearly not as successful as the independence movement that took place in the 40s. My grandfather remained in the Arab League until 1952. He served for 7 years as Secretary General of the Arab League.
As the first Secretary General of the Arab League.
He was very, very influential. He was actually known as Mr. Arab League because he would often just make decisions off the cuff and then convince other people to do it. So he was not just a Secretary General, he was a politician who used the Secretary General position to impose his views on what should happen. And then, of course, in 52, Egypt changes. There's a revolution in Egypt. There's a change of regime. There's a removal of the monarchy. And for a while, my grandfather remained on good terms. He was always on polite and diplomatic terms with Abdel Nasser. also with Anwar Sadat. And clearly there were some disagreements about the politics and the economic policies and so forth. A lot of our land was nationalized at that period. But the real disagreement, I would say, that took place, which eventually meant that my grandfather left Egypt, was over Nasser's decision to enter and fight in Yemen.
But that was later on in the 60s.
This would have been 61, 62, I'd say. So
okay. So he stayed in Egypt even after his tenure.
I think he stayed in Egypt. I'm not quite sure when he left Egypt. He would have left Egypt. He was there in the 50s. He may have left. No, I imagine he left in the late 50s. He must have seen the writing on the wall, I believe. He also spent some time in America with the Saudi government at the United Nations, working on several cases, including the Brahmi dispute case. But at that point, he had seen that things were not going to work out in Egypt in the way he wanted them to work out. He advised Abdel Nasser. He certainly wrote to him and contacted him.
I think Abdel Nasser visited you at home multiple times.
I met my grandfather very well. Yeah, they knew each other well. Of course, they would have known each other well. There's a great respect. He never disrespected my grandfather. He always spoke highly of him. There was nothing to disrespect about my grandfather. There was no. He was a pasha, of course. He was a noble as a pasha. But
I think he was also decorated by the Ottomans after
he was
the First
decorated
World War.
Ottomans as a younger man with the Iron Crescent for the fighting he fought with the Ottomans. But he was a man of remarkable honor. So there was very little to do. There was no corruption around him. There was nothing to hold against him. He was just a very honorable man. And Abdel Nasser recognized that. But I think it came down to Yemen, because I think my grandfather saw the disaster that Yemen would bring to Egypt. He knew that the Yemenis would fight forever, a guerrilla warfare. And he advised him strongly against his attacks against Saudi Arabia. And to a large extent, he worked very hard behind the scenes to create some kind of rapprochement between Egypt and Saudi Arabia at that time, because he realized that it would only lead to disaster. But Abdel Nasser was intent on his policy, which of course led to, 67 and what that followed. At that point, my grandfather he was in his 70s then. He became a very respected diplomat. He met many people. One interesting story is, of course, he became very close friends with Malcolm X himself, and that Alex Haley, in his autobiography of Malcolm X, talks about it. My grandfather's in Saudi Arabia when Malcolm X comes to Saudi Arabia to do the pilgrimage. It's all in Alex Haley's book, and they meet, and my grandfather speaks to them about Islam. He'd written a book at that point called The Eternal Message of Muhammad. And he was one of the people who convinced Malcolm X to move away from his attachment to the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, to a more traditional mainstream Islam. And my father also knew Malcolm X very well at that point. And in fact, Malcolm X had told my father that he would be killed, that he would not be allowed to stay alive, because he felt that America could tolerate him as a radical Nation of Islam who scared the white man. But if he ever espoused the mainstream Sunni Muslim Islam, that's even more dangerous, because that means Islam would spread much faster. So he knew many people. He knew my grandfather knew Dag Hammarskjöld, the UN Secretary General, and he actually, who was killed, as we know, in Africa. He knew many people, and he continued living. My father moved to Lebanon for his work. He moved with us, and I grew up with him. I had wonderful memories of him. He was a remarkable man. And my regret is that I didn't spend enough time asking him about. But I remember he always had an attachment to the land. He loved the land. He was an Egyptian. He loved his land. I remember being told stories that in cabinet meetings and during crises, he'd write a note. He'd want to know about the Gamusa on the land. He'd want to know what the Fallah has been doing. He had he loved the land like every Egyptian did. And he never lost that humility.
But I think your lands as a family, were eventually confiscated.
A lot of it was restored to us, I must say. A lot of it was restored under Sadat, I believe, including the house in Ma'adi, that a lot of the land was actually restored to us. But it's not so much that, it's more a love of the soil, of the land itself. He was a Fallah in the best sense of the word. He had the dignity of his attachment, and he was unshakable. And Yeah, so I was fortunate to have spent, the first 10 or 12 years of my life living with him, but never really having the time to ask him about himself. And so that's my grandfather.
I think his background as a freedom fighter against colonialism is the explanation of why during the civil war in Lebanon he seemed to
He was just a calm man. He was just a calm man. Yeah, he'd seen it all before. I think in Libya they tried to kill him a few times.
Who tried? The Italians?
The Italians, tried to kill him on several occasions. I think at one point there was a story, again, I don't know if I'm sure it's true. In fact, I know it's true. He was actually sentenced to death by the Italians in absentia. And then, of course, many years later, when he was a diplomat, he was going to go to a visit to Italy, a state visit to Italy. And of course, they realized that they had to scramble and change the law to repeal it. We've seen it before. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Margaret Thatcher was calling Nelson Mandela a terrorist. So, the definition of freedom fighter, terrorism, who would then become diplomats and politicians. He'd seen it all, my grandfather. He had this wisdom. He had that inner wisdom. He was very dear and very, very close to Malik Faisal of Saudi Arabia. He had a great respect and a great love between King Faisal and Abdurrahman Azam. And one of the most touching things I remember is when King Faisal was killed. I believe it was March 1975. Even as a young boy, I remember the whole world was shaken by it. We were living in Beirut. I remember we were totally shaken, the whole world. He was assassinated, as you remember, a couple of years after the 73 war when he tried to impose the oil embargo on the West. And my grandfather was a dear, dear friend of King Faisal. And of course, King Faisal's son married my aunt, so there's also blood between family links now between the two families. And it was those days where there was no television. Television was very basic, of course, the radio, newspapers. And my grandfather wasn't well. He had a heart condition. And I remember the doctor saying, do not tell him that King Faisal died. And I remember as a young man, as a young boy, we would make sure the radio was not on. Newspapers would tell him, they didn't deliver any newspapers today. It was much easier to access news. And we kept it from him. I think we told him that King Faisal had been ill, that he was, this and that. Until we told him that he died. And to this day, I remember him sitting in the sitting room and he was just weeping. And that is a memory that I've retained, that great sadness. So I have flashes of memories of him. I remember him not as much as I should have. My regret, he was a chain smoker. His doctor forbade him from smoking, so he tried to bribe us to get him a cigarette. It's a remarkable man, Allah yarhamuh.
I think he would be very happy that you're still carrying his stories and communicating them to others. I think that's one of the best things that you can do for the memory of your grandfather.
Absolutely.
So he passed away when you were 13,
yes,
I think?
Yes, he did. Yes.
So you said that your family moved from Egypt to Lebanon. I think that was because of your father's job with the UNDP, if I'm not mistaken.
He was at the UNDP in Saudi Arabia. He was an urban planner. He worked on a lot of the Mecca development. And then he started a private practice. And initially the UNDP in Lebanon, but eventually he started his own private practice with some Lebanese family, Quorum family. And that's where I grew up. I had an idyllic childhood. Anyone who grew up in Beirut in the 60s and 70s can only remember it with great fondness. So to me, I am 100% Egyptian, and I'm an Egyptian who's never really lived in Egypt, who's always lived abroad, but who's also carried a great and profound love for my country, for Egypt. But my memories are Lebanese.
You always talk to me about that feeling that you missed about living in Egypt. Can you tell me more about that? And the family decision in 1977, I think in 75, the civil war started in Lebanon. And by the December of 75, it was becoming clear that to continue to stay in Beirut was unsustainable. And we're nowhere where we're absolutely not unique. A lot of families were in the same position. And so we went to France for a year and a half. And we did so because we really hoped that we could go back to Beirut. So I missed a year of school and we went back and, we didn't, but we never went back. And the Lebanon chapter of my life has always been a very fixed chapter, which ended on the 20th of December, 1975. And I always say I've been born twice. I have that date and then the 20th of December, 1951. And I always thought I'd go back. I went back as an adult, but that's another story. And after a year or so in France,
my father made the decision that for the education of myself, my brother, my two sisters, that we would study in England. And I've always wondered, this was 1977. I've always wondered why he made that decision, and we could have gone back to Egypt. My grandfather had passed in 76. There was no problem. He was given a state funeral, more or less a state funeral when he died. Said that turned up to the funeral. So there was no longer a reason not to go back to Egypt. And I've always wondered why we never went back to Egypt. And I speak to my mother, Rabbana Fazha, is in good health, and I always speak to her about this. And of course, her response is that we were given the best. My father made a lot of sacrifices for us. He wanted us to have the best education. We ended up living in Cambridge, a beautiful city. I was so fortunate to have been accepted to go to Oxford, where I, as you know, read history, and then I did my DPhil there. And my life and my family and my siblings' life flourished in England. But like any exile, like anyone who's ever not, and I've been in England for nearly 50 years now, I'd say, and I love this country, of course. I'm, very, very fond of it. Deep attachment to England. But like any exile, like anyone, I keep wondering, what if? Had we gone back in the 70s, then I would have had what I see is your typical Egyptian childhood, where you have friends and you go to the Nadi, and I don't know if I'm sentimentalizing it or romanticizing it. And my mother, when I speak to her, has no time for sentimentality. She just says, Alhamdulillah, look, you wouldn't have succeeded. You wouldn't have achieved what you've achieved. Your brother would not have achieved. None of us would have achieved what you because of the educational opportunities that the United Kingdom offered, international exposure. But if I'm, in my honest moments, I always think, what if I had gone back? And like anybody, and that's a double exile, because to me, in a way, I'm talking about going back to Egypt. It's not a real Egypt, because I never lived in Egypt. And I couldn't have gone back to Lebanon, because Lebanon is not my country. I had 10, 11 wonderful years, but once that door closes, it's very hard to go back. There's I'm not Lebanese, I'm Egyptian. So to me, it was a kind of almost a romantic return. And it's something that's haunted me all my life, I would say. It's given me a certain trauma in a creative sense of the word, because my writing comes from that space. Other than Salah ad-Din, I've written a book called The Other Exile, which explores this idea in a much more profound way. And that's really the book where I put my heart and soul in. And it's the idea about exile. It means, what does it mean? I've been back to Egypt many times. I go back to Egypt 2-3 times a year now. I'm very fortunate to go back and have wonderful cousins and family and friends who are greatly loving. But to go back to Egypt as an adult is not like to go back to Egypt as a child. And there's always the part of me that says, what if? And then the rational side says, well, you should be grateful, and I'm utterly grateful to Allah that He has blessed me in ways which are immeasurable. But I'm haunted by this idea, and I draw from that creative tension to explore that what if scenario, that idea of exile, which of course, as I say, is common to anyone who's been through that experience.
That's very touching, Abdurrahman. I wish that one day you'd be able to experience living in Egypt and see what it's like and what the...
I probably won't last.
I'm sure you get to enjoy it in different ways.
No, I go back a lot and have wonderful, but it's too late, because Egypt now is the Egypt as an adult. It's that childhood memory.
Yes.
It's that innocence of childhood, which I'm really missing. And I think because it was taken away during the war in Lebanon, I always felt that I've missed out on that childhood innocence period. And I should never complain. Astaghfirullah, I should never complain. There are people who've had it 1,000 times worse than I have. And the poor people, when you look at what's happening in Gaza and in the world, we were so lucky and so blessed. But still, we went through a war and we came out of it, and it has left its emotional and mental scars. And to me, I've created an idyllic childhood in Egypt, which is probably not true at all. The reality is probably not there, but in my mind, it's there, and it runs parallel to my real life. Let's delve into the role that people with vision play during
tough times in history. And I think the story of your grandfather and the role that he played with the freedom movements in the Arab world during his time and his participation with the Libyan resistance against the colonization at the time. And I would like to take that as a starting point to what you've written about when it comes to Salah ad-Din. And I'm fascinated with the book that you've written on Salah ad-Din and the role that he played, not just on the military aspect, but beyond that, on the social and religious aspect as well. And it is very clear that during the times of crisis in different parts of the world and in different times in history, sometimes nations are blessed with people with vision and the might to get things done for the interest of their people. And I would like to focus on what Salah ad-Din and your research about him, what he did during that time. And I really want to delve deep into that because there are a lot of parallels to what we're going through today and what we can benefit from. And I'd like you to give the context of what was happening during the time when Salah ad-Din was still a young man.
First thing to say is that
it would be very interesting if you can relate Salah ad-Din to his family, to his grandfather, to his father and uncle, and the role they played and how they got together with the Zenkis.
Sure. I think to start off, to take a back step and explain the situation in the world at that time and how Salah ad-Din emerges into that world. The name Salah ad-Din is utterly and truly iconic. And before we even speak about Salah ad-Din or Saladin, one has to recognize that there's the myth of Salah ad-Din and there's the historical character of Salah ad-Din. In my book, I talk about, of course, the historical character who really was an absolutely fascinating man, and we will talk about that. But there's a legend around Salah ad-Din. There's a myth. He is so famous that I would argue that other than perhaps the Sahaba and, his name recognition is as famous as any Muslim you can get. Everyone's heard of Salah ad-Din. In the West, Saladin, Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi. But if you scratch the surface and you ask them, so what's he famous for? Again, you'll find that some people may say, well, he liberated Jerusalem. Some may say he's famous because of his chivalry and the way he acted and his honor and that. A few, not many, would say, he was a Kurd. But other than these three facts, they actually know very little about him. As you mentioned, we'll talk about his family, but nobody will be able to recognize his father or uncle or his grandfathers or these people. And it's because people prefer the myth and the legend to the man. And this tells us more about the age in which we live. And I'll start off with this reasonably controversial statement. If I were to say to you that the mausoleum of Salah ad-Din, which is, of course, in Damascus, who restored it? You might be surprised to know that it was actually restored by Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. He visited Damascus in 1898, and he was so shocked by the dilapidated state that the mausoleum was in that he ordered financing to restore it. So the question is, if Salah ad-Din was such a great hero, why was his mausoleum in such a state? The answer is more complex than we think. And again, we're putting aside the historical Salah ad-Din for a second, and we're going for the mythical Salah ad-Din. Salah ad-Din is only famous when Jerusalem is not in Muslim hands. The Salah ad-Din that emerges in the 19th century and the 20th century with the colonial movements, and then of course with Israel, is because the Arabs and the Muslims are looking for a hero to come and rescue them. So how often in our conversations do we hear people say, we need another Salah ad-Din? Only there was a Salah ad-Din. To me, this is both a reflection of the valor and the courage and the honor of Salah ad-Din, which we'll talk about. So they are referring to that historical figure, but it's also a abrogation of responsibility. It's a denial. It's almost throwing it on. Oh, if only there was a Salah ad-Din. What they don't recognize and what they don't accept, and this is what my book was about, is that Salah ad-Din, his greatness, other than his personal valor, which of course was enormous, Salah ad-Din was great because he lived in an age of great people, great men. And yet today, if you say to people, okay, everybody, you know Salah ad-Din, but Salah ad-Din did not liberate Jerusalem single-handedly. He did not fight the Crusaders single-handedly. Who else fought with him? I assure you, people will not be able to name a single person around him. I think because of the hero worship element, they want to worship the figure. They're not that interested in the historical figure of Salah ad-Din, who was a Kurdish warlord who died 900 years ago. So that's why you get characters such as Abdel Nasser, when he, Ahmed, what's his name? Yusuf Shaheen's film on Salah ad-Din. You get Saddam Hussein, who, of course, Tikriti, who's a Kurd. Saddam Hussein is from Tikrit. Of course, Salah ad-Din was a Kurd. You get Gaddafi, Hafez al-Assad, Arafat. Everybody says the new Salah ad-Din. They assume that mantle of Salah ad-Din. And they do that with the assumption that people know what Salah ad-Din is. Don't need to explain. So, I'm the new Salah ad-Din, and people assume, what does that mean? He's going to unite the Muslims. He's going to unite the Arabs. He's going to free us from our tyranny and from, the colonialism and so forth. And it's all going to be done by this one figure called Salah ad-Din. The West is also obsessed with Salah ad-Din, but for another completely different reason. And we will get to the historical side, I promise.
You mentioned in your book that Salah ad-Din was a product of a system that was established many years before he was born.
I will come back to that. Come back, but I just want to touch on the West, because the West is very interesting. The West talks about Saladin, the chivalry of Saladin, the honor of Saladin. A lot of the stories about Salah ad-Din's chivalry are absolutely true, and they were brought back by the Crusaders back to the West. But the West has a problem with Salah ad-Din, which is very, very profound, in that they could not but recognize his valor, his honor, his chivalry, his generosity, his incredible self-discipline. They recognize that. But what they refused, they could not accept that these values and virtues that Salah ad-Din had was simply him trying to emulate the virtues of the Prophet himself.
Prophet Muhammad, you mean?
Himself. Because they were fighting the Muslims. So they had to romanticize his Salah ad-Din and take him away from that. Because if they were to accept that, then they would simply recognize that Salah ad-Din was simply walking in the footsteps of the Prophet Muhammad. So you get this very kind of dance that they play where Salah ad-Din, they focus on the chivalry and the honor and, the stories of the legendary and all that. And you get these beautiful stories. I mean, as a child growing up again in Beirut, I remember the Ladybird history books, which I don't know if they're still published. They're absolutely, honestly, I say I learned history from the Ladybird books and from reading Asterix and Obelix. These are two great inspirations. They made me both fall in love with history. Beautiful book on Salah ad-Din, and Richard I. Them meeting and fighting with each other, and this wonderful story where Richard wants to show him how strong he is. So he gets out his sword and he strikes the sword against a metal bar, and he breaks the bar in two, and that is the might of Richard. And Salah ad-Din says, well, I'll show you how strong I am. And he throws up this silk scarf in the air, and he holds his very sharp scimitar straight, and as the silk scarf falls, it's cut exactly in half by the precision and the sharpness of this. I still remember that illustration in the Ladybird, and anyone, I would assure you, go and find it. You'll find it still there.
But that was an urban legend. That
Salah ad-Din and Richard never met.
They never met.
You can't believe how disappointed I was years later when I found out they never actually met. People prefer the legend. And it's okay, because it's the legend that made me fall in love with Salah ad-Din when I was a young boy, and many years later, let me write about him. We go back to your point. If we put this aside, and we look at what Salah ad-Din was, I have to make one further point before we get to it, which is that, to a large extent, the Crusades, why Salah ad-Din is famous? Because of the Crusades. Often we make a mistake, and we associate that for which a person is most famous, we assume was his greatest achievement. So in Salah ad-Din's case, Salah ad-Din is most famous because of his capture of Jerusalem, Therefore, we make an assumption that Salah ad-Din's capture Jerusalem was his greatest achievement. Today, we're going to talk about something else. It was not his greatest achievement. His greatest achievement took place in Egypt, and we'll come back to that. But to understand that, we first have to understand that the Crusades are by and large a Western obsession. They are the Crusades, they're the ones who kept attacking and inflicting damage on the Muslim world. But really, if you look at it in a very careful way, other than the coast of Syria and Palestine, where they established their kingdoms.
The four kingdoms.
And of course there's Jerusalem, and there's Edessa, which was in the north, and Edessa was the first of them to fall to Zengi, and we'll talk about Zengi in 1144. Other than that, they actually had very little impact on what I call the Muslim hinterland. If you were in Baghdad, you did feel them.
Even in Damascus, most of the time.
Apart from the Second Crusade, where they tried in a very shambolic way to capture Damascus, and Salah failed. He was a young man at that point. He was a young man living in Damascus at that time, so he would have had a childhood memory of it.
Was he in Damascus or Baalbek at the time?
I think he was in Damascus at that time, in 1144, 1145, 46, 47. He would have been in Damascus. He lived in Baalbek as well just before. So other than that, and Egypt we'll talk about, the Crusades had little impact. I would say the Mongol invasion had a much more devastating impact on the Muslim world. So let us for 1 second put the Crusades aside. And let us look at what was happening in the Muslim world at that time. And what was happening in the Muslim world at that time, independent of the Crusades, had a huge impact on the Crusades, but was independent. And that, we go back to our point. There was something called, and of course it's very hard to put labels on it because you cannot as a historian, you have to as a historian try to demarcate things, but it's almost impossible because it's an idea. What has come to be known as the Sunni revival. Islam was growing very fast, not just physically in numbers, but of course in the infrastructure, whether it's through the schools of law, in theology, in all aspects. And there were a huge amount of growing pains that were taking place. There was disputes between the madhahib, between the Hanbalis and the Shafi'is, and there was a great, and of course there were a considerable number of Shia that were currently, both the Ismaili Fatimid Shia who were primarily in Egypt, but also Shia in Syria and in Iraq. And there's a time when Baghdad was under Shia control, when the Buyids dynasty was in charge. And the Abbasid Caliph was militarily very, very weak, symbolically strong, but militarily weak. And Islam was beginning to fragment and fracture. And it was that time that two geniuses appeared, and we're talking about the 1090s, 1080s, 1090s, 1100s. Salah ad-Din was born in 1136, so this was about 20, 30 years prior to Salah ad-Din's birth, so it's just the generation before Salah ad-Din. And these two great geniuses who came together, I'd say, laid the foundation for what today is Sunni Islam. Of course, the famous Al-Ghazali that everyone has heard about, and his magisterial Ihya al-Din, his work, his example, great, everything. Great. The sort of the myths that he was anti-philosophy. He's a great philosopher, great theologian, Sufi, of course, a great man. He was also the professor of the Nizamiya Madrasa. And here we come to the other great man,
Nizam al-Mulk,
the Seljuk vizier, Nizam al-Mulk. The Seljuks were Turkish warlords who came and were ruling Baghdad at that time, and they appointed Nizam al-Mulk.
But they were ruling Baghdad under the umbrella of the Abbasid Caliphate.
The legitimacy came from the Abbasids because they had no legitimacy, but of course the military was strengthened from the Seljuks.
But they had their own capital outside of Baghdad.
But Baghdad was the symbolic capital, which was critical for them because it gave them legitimacy. And everybody, the whole age was one of legitimacy. How do you get legitimacy? Even Salah ad-Din struggled with this issue. Everybody was struggling with it. And the only legitimacy you could get is by getting letters of investiture or robes of honor from the Abbasid Caliph, who was the one person who could afford that you are working in the lineage of the Sunni orthodox line.
Even during the Mamluk, when after the fall of Baghdad in 1258, the Mamluks took in the Abbasid family to provide that legitimacy for their ruling in Egypt and the Levant.
And it's absolutely fundamental. And one of the questions, we're not going to talk about it today, but one of the questions is the Muslim world not having a caliphate since the 1920s. How much? But that's not really an issue for me. So we go back to that period when Nizam al-Mulk becomes vizier and realizes that what was needed was a profound way of holding the Islamic world together. He recognized al-Ghazali's genius and he appointed him, and he set up a many madrasas, initially in Nishapur, then in Baghdad, known as the Nizamiyya.
So it was called after him.
And it was there to teach. Madrasas in those days was a school of law. Darasa was to teach law. That was implicit. And in his case, he was a Shafi'i, so it was a Shafi'i law. But of course, it was much more than that. And what emerges with these madrasas initially was the opportunity for Muslims from different persuasions to come together and to start intermingling and trying to understand that your opinion of Islam does not mean that the other person's opinion of Islam is wrong, let alone being a kafir or so forth. So again, we speak about Ghazali. Ghazali understood philosophy. Ghazali was a philosopher. Ghazali understood philosophy extremely well. But Ghazali also argued that philosophy had its limitations, that one cannot attain the truth, the ultimate truth, through philosophy, because the philosophy was a mental exercise which, by its own nature,
I think that was depicted in his book, Tahafut al-Falasifa, or the contradiction of philosophers.
And in a way, people always talk to him about, there's a whole movement against al-Ghazali that he somehow was very rigid and so forth, far from the truth.
That was championed by Ibn Rushd, Averroes, who published Tahafut al-Tahafut, the contradiction.
But there's a great respect between these people. I mean, often we look
back. They did not overlap. Ibn Rushd wrote that book after Ghazali had died.
Are you sure? I'm not
so I don't think they overlapped.
Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, we can check that.
1130s, I'm not quite sure. They may have overlapped. I'm not sure. المهم, so what happens now is that on an intellectual level, a new Islam starts emerging. Not new, I shouldn't say new. A definition of Islam starts emerging. Which is
a new school of Islamic...
Not school, no. It's an Islam which compromises certain pillars. Adherence to a madhab, but at no point a rigid adherence. In that sense, you could be a Shafi'i, you could be a Hanbali, you could be a Maliki, you could be a Hanafi. It doesn't matter anymore. It was a theological approach, which was defined by, what do you call it, Ash'ari Islam, which used a bit of rationalism, a bit of argument's sake, a bit of philosophy, a bit of kalam. It was an Islam which had some mystical Sufi tendencies, so many of the people were followers of Sufi shuyukh. And it was that melange and that definition. And in a way it was defined in response to the Shia encroachment that was taking place. Because before the Shia encroachment, the Sunni Muslims did not need to define themselves. But once, and as we know, the Azhar was established in Egypt, and don't forget the Azhar was established as Ismaili Shia propaganda center. The Azhar that we know today as a great Sunni orthodoxy was not, of course, that in its initial stage. The Muslims felt that they needed to define this. And the genius of Ghazali is that he's the one who really put all these threads together. So today, the Islam that we practice is very much in the footsteps of Ghazali. And I think we owe him a huge debt of gratitude. Nizam al-Mulk took this and turned it into a political vehicle. Or I should say a state vehicle, not a state vehicle, through madrasas. And before you know it, madrasas spread like wildfire across the Muslim world.
As an institution.
Institution, big and small, big cities, small villages. And if we were to look at it, the introduction of madrasas into Syria was the work of our second hero of the story, or maybe the third one after Ghazali, Nizam al-Mulk, the great Nuruddin. So Nuruddin Zengi, the son of Zengi, and we'll come back to Zengi.
Let's move from that generation of Nizam al-Mulk and al-Ghazali and the role that they played in the institutionalization of al-Madrasa أو النظامية to a later stage with the emergence of عماد الدين زنكي. And could you...
Yes.
And obviously with his son, Nur al-Din ibn Zenki. So could you tell us more about what happened and how those madaris were fundamental in creating the ecosystem that later on led to the emergence of someone like Salah ad-Din?
Yes. We have to look at it as a generational thing, which of course it is. So Ahmad ad-Din al-Zengi, who would have been a young boy when Ghazali died. So it more or less crossover that period of time. But it's also we have to look at it in two different perspectives. One as a geographical. So now we're moving the story to another generation, but we're moving from Baghdad to Syria. And the third factor is the one that I mentioned earlier. All this was happening, the move of the madrasas into Syria, the move of Ahmad ad-Din al-Zengi into Syria. He was the ruler of Mosul, and his dream was to capture Aleppo, to capture Mosul and Aleppo, to put them under one rule. Was happening independently of the Crusade movement. Now, it's important to keep our eye on the dates here. The Crusaders arrived and they captured Jerusalem in, I believe, 1098. Independent of that, 1092, Nizam al-Mulk was assassinated, and Ghazali dies on the famous date that every school child knows, 11/11. So keep in mind that what I've been talking about, which were the seeds of the Sunni revival through the manifestation of madrasas and the students that were emerging from this madrasa. And I should add here that madrasas, there was no fixed curriculum in these madrasas. It wasn't like a school or university we think of today. People went for as little or as long as they went to. They could drop out, and often the madrasa was not important. What was important was the professor who taught at the madrasa. But it did create this homogeneity, which we'll talk about. So the formation of these madrasas, the move of the madrasas to Syria, was happening independent and not in any way in response to the Crusaders, but would actually, fortuitously, would save Islam against the Crusaders. And that's the remarkable thing about history. If we would simply read it through a narrative of Richard and Salah ad-Din, the Crusaders and the Muslim counter-crusade and so forth, we're only seeing it from one perspective. When we actually understand it from an organic internal view, you see this emergence, generational, geographic, as something which is actually independent. So having established the madrasas in Baghdad and in areas around Baghdad, we now move to Syria. And the story begins with the famous Ahmad ad-Din Zengi. And for those who write about Salah ad-Din and those who have read his story, the temptation is always to look at it as a triple jump. Ahmad ad-Din Zengi, his famous son, Nur al-Din Zengi, Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi. These are the three names, almost like a mantra, that are repeated. It's like a triple jump. It's not accurate. They were not of the same quality whatsoever. Ahmad ad-Din Zengi was a warlord, a really tough Turk warlord who ruled by fear. Those who went against him were crucified. He was like I think Ibn al-Athir described him as a leopard in fury. He was a man who ruled with an iron fist. He was a tough soldier. And his dream was to move his force and his power, influence from Mosul into Aleppo. And that time Syria was completely under many petty rulers, emirs. And they're all fighting Damascus and Aleppo and Homs and Haman or Baalbek, and they're all under different rulers, and it's all a complete chaos.
Ahmad ad-Din Zengi was responsible for a massacre in Aleppo and Baalbek.
He probably was. I can't remember, but I'm sure he was responsible for many massacres. He was not known for his generosity, his clemency. He massacred many people, but he was a turning point. Yes, of course, the massacre shall come back to. Of course, there was a turning point, and in a way. So he was born around 1085 or so, and he lived, and he would have witnessed, he'd have been a 10-year-old when a teenager, when the Jerusalem was falling. We don't know how he reacted to that. We don't know if it meant anything to him. But he would have seen the emergence of these crusader states now. Zengi was not interested in the intellectual movements that were taking place. And proof of that is he did not build madrasas. And if one were to argue that a symbol or a symbol of adherence to the Sunni revival, if one can call it that, or to the intellectual mindset that was taking place, the zeitgeist, was the building of madrasas, which of course Nuruddin and Salah ad-Din were champions of, then the fact that Zengi built no madrasas is proof that he was not on the same intellectual wavelength as the others. But he did one thing, and that one thing he did makes him into that triple jump, and in a way forgives all his kind of faults, if one can say that. Zengi in 1144 took Edessa, the first of the Latin kingdoms.
Raha.
It was a huge seismic shock for the West, and it was the first, what they call the first counter-crusade, the first Muslim revanche of the Muslims getting the act together. The Muslims were utterly disorganized. We talk about the Fatimids ruling Egypt. Whether the Fatimids knew about the approach of the Crusades has long been debated by historians, whether they had prior knowledge, whether they were colluding with them. These are all questions. But the fact is there was no resistance whatsoever to them. And the fragmentation and the insular outlook of these Muslim rulers allowed the Crusades to take it. So again, let's look at the time frame. 1098, 1144. This is the period when the Muslims started, if one can call it that, to get the act together. And in 1144, Edessa fell to Zengi, Ahmad-ad-Din Zengi. And in his Ahmad-ad-Din Zengi style, he showed no mercy. The massacre was quite severe. And interestingly enough, he distinguished between the Latin Christians, the Eastern Orthodox Christians, the Nestorians, the Jacobites, the Christians who were living there, and the Franks, the Western Christians. So he was clearly somebody who knew, who was the enemy. And he did, so the massacres were inflicted upon more on the Western Christians than on the Eastern Christians. But it was bloody. It was very vicious. And as I said, it sent absolute shockwaves to the West. And as soon as the Pope hears about it and so forth, and the European kings, they immediately launch a second crusade to recapture. So Edessa is a turning point. And in that sense, Ahmad-ad-Din Zengi deserves his position in that triple jump I mentioned. But he was not in tune with the intellectual milieu that was taking place. That is also clear. He dies, and his son, the famous Nuruddin Zengi, emerges. And here we need to understand again the geopolitics, because it's a parallel thing. First of all, Nuruddin is the man who builds the madrasas. He's the one who's the patron of the shiukh. He's the one who supports the Sufi shiukh. He is a great, great patron of Islamic learning. But on a geopolitical sense, Nuruddin, again, Turkish warlord, very powerful. He's the one who succeeds in, it's divided between him and his brother, then his brother dies and so forth. But ultimately, what you need to understand is this. And this really goes to the heart of it and comes back to the question of Egypt. The Latin kingdom, or the Latin kingdoms, of which the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem is the key one, for it to fall, for the Muslims to regain that momentum, to defeat them, then certain planets had to align. And for that to happen, you needed to get the Muslim army and the forces of northern Iraq, of Mosul, but you also needed to unite Aleppo and Damascus. Whoever controlled Mosul, Aleppo, and Damascus would begin to create a pincer movement of men, of armies, of course, of power, of influence, that the Latin kingdom could not offset. Because ultimately the Crusaders, the Franks, the Latin kingdom relied constantly on men coming from the West to fight crusades. The moment the Latin kingdoms were established, the West stopped sending people. And you get desperate letters coming all the time from from the east going westwards, saying, you've got to help us, we're going to fall. Edessa provoked the second crusade, which was a complete failure. But that period between the fall of Edessa in 1144 and, of course, Salah ad-Din's victory in 1187 is a period where the Latin kingdom was running out of men, was not able to replenish its men, and with Nur ad-Din strengthening his position in Syria, and he's the first person who manages to rule Aleppo and Damascus at the same time.
Najm ad-Din Ayyub, who was Salah ad-Din's father, played an important role in the unification of Aleppo and Damascus.
Najm ad-Din and his brother Asad ad-Din Shirkuh came in his father Shadi. There's the children of Shadi who were Kurdish, came from near Tikrit. Salah ad-Din, of course, is from a Kurdish family, and it's an interesting because ultimately the relations between the Turks and the Kurds were probably much as they were then as they are now. There's a great, suspicion between them. The Turks were the great power of this period. Salah ad-Din was Kurdish. He was very proud of his Kurdish roots. He was actually born, and he grew up he wasn't born in Baalbek, but he grew up as a young boy in Baalbek and then in Damascus. And he would have spoken Arabic. He would have known a bit of Turkish as well, because the Turks were the soldiers, so the commands were given in Turkish. And at an early stage, Najm ad-Din and Asad ad-Din Shirkuh entered into the service of Imad ad-Din Zengi, and then following that, entered into the service of Nur ad-Din. They were his lieutenants. They were his, eventually Asad ad-Din would lead Nur ad-Din's armies. They were his trusted confidants, lieutenants. And it's in that world of service to Nur ad-Din that Salah ad-Din was born and grew up. So it was very much as his liege, as his patron, that Nur ad-Din brings up Salah ad-Din in that environment. And Najm ad-Din, who was a very wise and diplomatic man, and I'm sure Salah ad-Din took a lot from his father, who advised Nur ad-Din on how to capture Damascus, because ultimately, as I said, the jigsaw was nearly completed. If you got Mosul, Aleppo, and Damascus, the jigsaw was nearly completed, and that, of course, only left the final piece, the treasure, which is Egypt, and we'll come back to that. If you capture Mosul, Aleppo, and Egypt, it's game over, in a sense, for the Latin kingdom, because they're completely encircled. The people of Damascus were very scared of Nur ad-Din. They're very worried about Nur ad-Din. But of course, the second crusade, when it came, instead of trying to recover Edessa, was a complete chaos from day one. And they actually ended up trying to lay siege to Damascus. And it got bogged down, and it was a complete failure. But it scared the people of Damascus. And the people of Damascus were looking at Nur ad-Din and thinking, well, if he's like his father, this is not going to end well, because we did not want his father to rule us, and look what happened, his reputation. And Najm ad-Din had a huge role to play in this. He would have convinced them, he would have spoken to the elders, the notables of the city, people like Kamal ad-Din Shahrazuri and other people who were there, and convinced them that actually the son was not like the father. The son was a much more moderate, much more diplomatic, much wiser, much more pietistic person. And eventually Damascus came under the rule of Nur ad-Din. Now that's the politics. If we go back to the intellectual mindset, or what was happening, this is where you get a total flourishing of madrasas appearing suddenly. And they're everywhere. Even Shirkuh and Najm ad-Din and everyone is suddenly building madrasas all the place. And it was a period when people were not building mosques. They were building madrasas. This was the feeling. There was a kind of momentum, and there's been some very good scholarly work that's been done on this about the number of madrasas built in their hundreds, producing thousands of, if one can use the word graduates, but people emerging you can't use the word graduates, but people emerging from these madrasas. And what begins to appear suddenly is, I mentioned, a kind of homogeneity of people emerging. Different madhabs, but more or less attuned to the same thing, sympathetic to Sufism, sympathetic to Kalam, to Ash'ari thought, sympathetic to philosophy, kind of middle of the road. But what the critical aspect that took place was this. These people, until then, Islamic knowledge and Islamic learning was in the domain of people who had other professions. You were a scholar and you did another job. That suddenly these people were emerging from the madrasas, and if anything one can call them, institutionalize them. These people began to assume positions in government and in bureaucracy. So you had the emergence of people like Ahmad-Din Isfahani, Bahadin Mushaddad, the two great secretaries and the biographers of Salah ad-Din, were both graduates of the Nizamiyya. So you start getting a kind of alma mater of people who are emerging from a madrasa, who have been grounded in a certain Islamic learning, but who now assume positions of administration and power and governance. And that also created a very, very powerful dynamic. Because suddenly, these people could speak to each other. If you went to madrasa in Homs or Hama or Baalbek or Damascus or Aleppo, suddenly the conversation was not as varied, and that the uniformity starts emerging. And that uniformity, to a large extent, is what saves Islam. That stamp. And I don't think one can ever underestimate the importance of the madrasa in safeguarding this. So now we get this position where we have a formidable king in Jerusalem, Latin king, a man called Amalric. Really quite a formidable king. And he is aware of what's happening. He sees the threat of Nur ad-Din. He understands that with Damascus and Aleppo under Nur ad-Din's hands, he's being cornered. And all eyes turn to the final piece in the jigsaw, the most precious one, which is Egypt. Whoever controls Egypt will control the destiny of that region. And
the Fatimid Caliphate at the time
was called the Fatimid Caliphate was already on its very weak.
The old man by the Nile.
By the Nile. It was extremely weak. And this is, of course, where Salah ad-Din enters history. Salah ad-Din enters history in Egypt as a young man. So we have this story where Nur ad-Din has got his eyes on Egypt. Egypt for the last 200 years ostensibly was a Fatimid Ismaili country. In reality, the number of Ismaili Shia in Egypt would have been minuscule. The vast majority of people in Egypt have either been Sunni Muslims, Christians. There were a lot of Jews as well there. A lot of Armenians, Christians as well. So other than the Fatimid Caliph, his family, even the viziers were no longer Ismaili. They were viziers. There were Ismaili, there were Sunni viziers, there were Kurdish Sunni viziers. There was Armenian, of course, the great, the Badr al-Jamali and all that were Armenian originally. And Egypt was fundamentally important. We know why. The wealth of Egypt, the manpower of Egypt, the connection to Mecca and Medina, Egypt, the connection to Africa, to the Yemen. The richness and the treasures of Egypt were astonishing. And the issue was no longer Jerusalem. The issue was no longer controlling the Syrian cities, which were now very much under the control of the Muslim Nur ad-Din, and was extremely unlikely that these cities would now fall into anarchy as they did before now, because he held them very tightly. And so Nur ad-Din now understands that if he's going to defeat Amalric, he's not going to defeat him on the battlefield now. He had to focus on capturing Egypt, controlling that supply of men and wealth and power. And if that fell to him, and if Egypt could be restored from Fatimid Ismaili to Sunni Islam, and I would argue that for Nur ad-Din and for Salah ad-Din, the restoration of Egypt into the Sunni fold was as great as the capture of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, of course, held huge spiritual, symbolic importance. But as far as strategic and military significance, Egypt, of course, would trump Jerusalem any time.
But to be fair, the last Fatimid Caliph, Al-Adid, played a role in that as well. And
I think in a way the Fatimids have been demonized a lot, because the story, as we know how the story is going to end, and in a way knowing how the story is going to end, in a way allows us certain liberties, whereas in fact reading the sources, Al-Adid, who was a young man, he died when he was 21, recognized the weakness of his country and recognized that Amalric and the Franks had their eyes on Egypt. And as the bureaucracy and the system in Egypt began to weaken, there was a real threat that Egypt would then fall under the control of the Christian rulers. And for Al-Adid, Ismaili or not, felt that the risk to Islam was too great. So he sends a letter to Nur ad-Din. He pleads with Nur ad-Din to come and rescue Egypt from this risk. So in a way, it goes against the narrative that we know that somehow those the Fatimid Ismailis were the bad guys and the Sunnis. So it was much more nuanced. It was much more subtle than.
And he clarified this vision in the letter that he sent to Nur ad-Din, saying that he would rather sacrifice himself and his family for the unification of the Muslims at the time.
Yeah, I don't know how much rhetoric that is and how much truth there is in that, but he set the ball rolling. He set the ball rolling. Of course, Nur ad-Din was cautious. He was cautious because controlling and ruling Egypt was an enormous endeavor through its size and power. He didn't have the manpower to do it. He knew the risks of doing that. But on the other hand, he could not afford Amalric to control Egypt. So this is really where he turns to his most trusted people. He turns to As-ad-Din Shirkuh, and he sends him on 3 different occasions to capture Egypt. He fails for the
3 different expeditions.
And
Salah ad-Din was part of the 3.
Salah ad-Din, as a young man, emerges in his 20s as his lieutenant. In one of them, he is actually besieged in Alexandria, and he endures this terrible siege, and afterwards he promises he'll never go back to Egypt. And there's this story,
even if he's given the rule of Egypt, I think
he said that. And one reads, the reluctant hero is one. Yeah, I mean, don't forget, we're talking about Imad ad-Din Zengi earlier. We're talking about these people, As-ad-Din Shirkuh. These people grew up under warlords, and they were tough military people. They would have eaten Salah ad-Din alive had he been this reluctant hero. I don't believe in that. I think this is penmanship written by sources trying to make him into, I didn't want power. Power was thrust upon me.
Associating many other qualities.
Yeah, the pipe was still going. Like in a way, like Shakespeare's Henry V. A kind of Falstaff thing about being this and then becoming a virtuous king and all that. Salah ad-Din went with his uncle to support his uncle. He fought very bravely in Alexandria. He withstood the siege. He went back. That
was during the time of the vizier of the Fatimids at the time was Shawar.
Yeah, and he was
Shawar was actually had a pact with Amalric.
Yes,
and
because Shawar did not want Egypt to fall to Nur ad-Din, so he was trying to play them off. But of course, and Shawar ends up dead as well after that, because you cannot play this game too long. And
Amalric during that time gained a lot of power in Egypt, and his army was in Egypt for some time.
Because every time Shawar played this game, Amalric would get stronger, but he was trying to play both and trying to win people off. And it was an end game for the Fatimids in a way. And so on the 3rd occasion, Shirkuh had enough of all of this. And Shirkuh was a tough man, a really, really tough man.
He pleaded to the Abbasid Caliph to send a letter to Nur ad-Din Zengi to persuade him to send another expedition to Egypt. And I think it was that letter from the Abbasid Caliph.
Possibly.
Who was the Caliph at the time?
I can't remember now. But possibly, but I think Egypt was too important. I think whether there was Caliph or not, Egypt had to fall. And the fact that under Shawar, the Amalric came so close would have sent huge alarm bells ringing in Syria. So on the 3rd expedition, on the 3rd campaign, finally.
And that really shows the wisdom of Al-Adid at the time, that he went against his vizier and he preferred that pact with Nur ad-Din.
I think there were desperate times. I don't know how much. I mean, one cannot doubt the sincerity of Al-Adid. I just don't know, because it's hard to know what happened. Because there's also the idea that they probably also felt that Nur ad-Din is going to come and save us, and then somehow we'll get rid of Nur ad-Din. So it was it was all realpolitik taking place.
Okay.
Yeah, they probably thought these people are going to come, have a small campaign, And don't forget, they failed twice to capture Egypt. So they thought they'd just come fight it and then they'll get tired and go back to Syria. I think they probably underestimated Nuruddin's determination to control Egypt. On the third campaign, Shirkuh finally puts an end to all this. He has Shawar slain.
So he did kill him.
Yeah. And he controlled the country. And finally, the Amalric realized that there was no way they're just too powerful. So it took 3 attempts. But of course, they couldn't control Egypt. Egypt was still bubbling, as we shall find out, under Salah ad-Din. And Salah ad-Din, as a young man, as we said, reluctant. He didn't want to go back. He was persuaded to go back. I'm not sure how much I believe in that story. He ends up in Egypt. And lo and behold, within a few weeks.
But there was fighting. Was there any confrontation with Malrik and his army? Or did they just go back to Jerusalem without fighting?
I think there must have been some clashes, but it became very clear to Amalric that Amalric's army cannot withstand a big campaign in Egypt because he didn't have the manpower, because he had to defend, of course, Jerusalem and so forth. So it could not have been a long-standing campaign. He didn't have the manpower to fight Shirkuh in Egypt. Shirkuh then becomes vizier. So there's still the fig leaf of the Fatimid Caliph. The Caliph was still there. He appoints Shirkuh as vizier. And even till that point, there was still this kind of belief that somehow he's going to play Shirkuh off the others and that maybe the Fatimids would remain. After all, many other viziers had come and they'd been played off each other, and some were killed, some were not killed. And within a few weeks, of course, Shirkuh dies unexpectedly. Some see he overeating. Actually, that's the popular story. He probably had too much Egyptian molochi. So he dies within a few weeks.
And then Al-Adil dies.
Yeah, no, but before then, Salah ad-Din becomes vizier. And this is when Salah ad-Din emerges. Until now, he's in the shadows of history. He's a quiet man. He does what he's been told to do. And suddenly, Shirkuh's nephew becomes the vizier, Salah ad-Din. Others wanted it. There were other people in that campaign, in an army who wanted it. But for some reason, and there's a man called Isa al-Hakkari who played a pivotal role in convincing them that Salah ad-Din as the nephew. Now, this again goes against this argument that, he was reluctant. Because had he at all been reluctant, then these people around him would not have allowed him to take power. He must have had a drive and an ambition that does not emerge in the sources, but it must have been there. And he is appointed vizier. And the Fatimids were delighted because they thought this is a young man who he can control. As-ad-Din Shirkuh was a formidable warlord, a really tough man who apparently used to dictate his letters on horseback and who would just never get off his horse because he was really quite, he felt comfortable on.
And he was quite different from his brother.
Completely. I don't think he had the diplomacy of his brother.
Salah ad-Din's father.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know, but I think Shirkuh would have probably been closer to Imad ad-Din Zingi in his kind of toughness. But so the Fatimids probably thought, we can handle this young man. We're talking about somebody who's in his probably late 20s, early 30s, probably at that point. We can handle him. And he doesn't know much about Egypt. He's so far away from his power base. He only had some people around him called the Asadiyya, who were the soldiers and As-ad-Din Shirkuh's men around him to protect him.
But they're called Asadiyya after the name of As-ad-Din Shirkuh.
Yeah, they were his kind of entourage, his soldiers. And they're the only people he had around him. And he was ruling a land which was enormous. A land, as you know, ancient from the time of the pharaohs. We're talking about the generations. A land of enormous wealth. And he knew nothing about this country. And he had to survive. And the first few years of Salah ad-Din's vizierate were enormously difficult. And this is where he really showed his qualities, his steadfastness, his diplomacy. He has good relations with Wa'atid initially. He remains very diplomatic. He remains very polite. And you could see signs of Nuruddin getting anxious, saying, but finish the job. You've got to finish the job. I sent you to Egypt to restore Sunni orthodoxy, to have the Abbasid's name mentioned in the Friday khutbah. Why are you still playing this charade of honoring the Fatimid Caliph?
Instead, he and Adad were seen at the Friday prayer together.
Well, Adad was younger than him, but they're both young men. And I think to a large extent, Salah ad-Din was a cautious man. And I think he was just beginning to realize that if he were to rush into this, things could go really wrong. He didn't know who his enemies were. He didn't know who was going to support him. It required a huge bureaucracy to run Egypt, as you can imagine. The tax collection and the Nile and everything. And you know what the Egyptians are like. It's very hard to rule them when you just don't know. Because he was not an Egyptian. He didn't understand them. He was seen as a foreigner. And I think the first period in Salah ad-Din's time in Egypt was one of great caution. He was certainly more diplomatic than others. I think had he rushed it, there may have been more rebellions. There were attempts to kill him, of course, and many assassination attempts. There were many rebellions.
By the Sudanese.
The Sudanese were, of course, with, funding from Amalric and that. Amalric launches, tries to capture the Miata. There are 2-3 campaigns against him, which he has to defend. And Salah ad-Din has to take a very quick action. And almost the first thing he does is he calls his family to Egypt. He's the only people he can trust. His family, his brother, Turan Shah, and other people.
Why did Nur ad-Din allow that?
The struggle.
He had no fear that the Ayyubids later on, or Salah ad-Din at the time.
I think that the whole Nur ad-Din, Salah ad-Din thing is been slightly overplayed. The tension between them, people who see would have gone to conflict. We have to see it from their historical perspective. Nur ad-Din had achieved what he'd always wanted to achieve, which he's finally can control Egypt. On the other hand, Salah ad-Din suddenly begins to open his eyes and realize that the Egypt that he was now ruling was far wealthier than Syria. He was sitting on the treasures of men and money and wealth and richness and geographical locations and so forth. And not that he was trying to disobey Nur ad-Din, but you cannot rush into these things. So a tension begins to emerge, without doubt. And of course, Al-Adid then dies naturally. And I think in a way that clears the path for Salah ad-Din. Had Al-Adid continued to live, I think Salah ad-Din would have had more tension what to do with the Fatimid Caliph.
Did he really die naturally?
One of Salah ad-Din's closest confidants and advisors, one of the people who he really trusts more than anyone, was a man called Al-Qadi al-Fadil. Qadi al-Fadil was a bureaucrat, a consummate bureaucrat.
He has a famous mosque?
No, I don't think
so.
No.
That's my...
No, I think it's Omar al-Fadil. That's different. He was a man from Gaza, Ascalon. He was a man who was a bureaucrat who went to Egypt in the Fatimid period, and he worked under the Fatimid Chancery for many, many years. He was a consummate bureaucrat. He was a Sunni Muslim. And he could see the writing on the wall. He could see that the Sunni Muslims were beginning to triumph. Alexandria was a hotbed of Sunni Islam, and he could see that it's now beginning, the tide was turning. And very early on, he came into Salah ad-Din's service, and he would end up being on Salah ad-Din's side and his closest advisor and friend until Salah ad-Din's death. It was Al-Qadi al-Fadil who buried Salah ad-Din eventually, who pays for his funeral and his shroud. So he remained with him throughout his life.
Because Salah ad-Din died as a poor man.
Salah ad-Din dies as a penniless man. By that time, when Salah ad-Din dies, 1193, he's already the most powerful man in the Muslim world. I mean, we've moved forward in our story, but this is a man who controlled Yemen, Mecca, Medina, Egypt, some North Africa, Syria, Iraq, Mosul. All this was under his sultanate, a very powerful man. And yet he was completely penniless because he gave away all his money to charity. In fact, Al-Qadi al-Fadil, who at that time was running his administration, would never tell Salah ad-Din exactly how much money Salah ad-Din had in his budget, because if he told him the truth, Salah ad-Din would just spend it. So you'd always, tell him he had much less, so that, and eventually Salah ad-Din does die in Damascus, and he has actually no money for his shroud to be bought. It's the Qadi al-Fadil. He was an astonishing man, Salah ad-Din. We'll talk about that, but first we have to, we go back to Egypt, and Amalric tries desperately to get rid of Salah ad-Din. Nur ad-Din is putting him under enormous pressure. Al-Adid's death in a way clears the air, because that means that there is no Fatimid Caliph after him.
What did he do with the family, with the royal family?
Interestingly, he decided that he was going to separate the men from the women. And he allowed them to continue living there, but not to breed. And there are stories that many, many years later, very old people who are still alive were just dying one by one. It's a very ingenious way, one can argue. I can imagine that Ahmad ad-Din Zengi would have probably handled it in a different way, or other people, maybe Shirk, would have handled it in a different way. And of course, the Fatimid Ismailis are the ones that today,
The Aga Khans.
yeah, we have the great affinity to Egypt.
But so that was that prohibition of breeding between the men and the women that applied to the direct family of Al-Adid, but not to the extended family of the Fatimids.
I don't know exactly.
So the extended part of the royal family
must have continued somewhere. Or they may not have been in Egypt, they may have left Egypt. I'm not sure about that. But that was his solution, to make sure that there was no... But by that point, as soon as Al-Adid died, in any case, the call to prayer changed, and the Abbasid Caliph's name was now in the Friday prayers. The coins were minted in the Abbasid Caliph's name, and Egypt was brought back into Sunni fold, and Azhar became a Sunni institution. And what Salah ad-Din, of course, does to continue our Sunni revival story is he started to build madrasas.
But I would like to pause here and just for the sake of just, putting everything in its place. The Aga Khan family today is the continuation of the Fatimid royal family. So
I don't know exactly. Yes, that must be, because they're both Ismailis, and I imagine there is a continuation, but I really am not an expert on Ismaili history. The Aga Khan, of course, has a great love for Egypt because of that. Ahl al-Bayt, the love of Ahl al-Bayt comes from the Fatimid Ismaili legacy for Egypt. How the lineage works, I would have to speak to somebody who knows. But they are definitely Ismaili Fatimid, they're Ismaili Shia, but they may have come from other parts, and from Egypt, from other parts of the Ismaili dynasty. I simply don't. Not all the Ismailis ended up in Egypt after all. I don't know. It's a very interesting. So Salah ad-Din is in power.
Because some of them left Egypt before all of those.
Some must have been. Yeah, I imagine. I think if we spoke to an Ismaili expert, he would clear
probably,
that easily.
I think we have to investigate that.
I think that's easy. I think it probably came from the Ismaili branch that were not in Egypt. Not all of them were in Egypt, of course. But Al-Adid's death meant that Salah ad-Din no longer had to worry about that. His next problem was how to secure his country, the land he was ruling. Many rebellions, the Zenj rebellion, the Amalric's attempt to destabilize him. It was very interesting because when Amalric heard that, and then, of course, the tension between Nur ad-Din and Salah ad-Din continues to increase.
Even after the death of Al-Adid?
Yes, because Nur ad-Din wanted Salah ad-Din to send men to fight the crusade, the Franks. Salah ad-Din was reluctant. He was saying, I still need to audit. So Nur ad-Din sends him somebody to do his auditing for him. There's tension beginning to emerge. And this is a natural tension between the ruler of somebody who rules Syria and somebody who rules Egypt. And suddenly the relationship is no longer one of somebody in the service of Nur ad-Din, but somebody who ends up ruling a land which is far greater than Syria. And that, of course, Salah ad-Din being, both men were exceptionally diplomatic. But of course there'll be tension, because there is a power struggle that starts to emerge. Now, people have argued that had it continued, then there would have been conflict between them. Nur ad-Din could have recalled Salah ad-Din. Whether Salah ad-Din would have gone back to Syria is extremely unlikely. He was ambitious. He was already building his entourage, as I said. He was asking his father, Najm ad-Din, joins him in Egypt. His brothers start joining him in Egypt. His children are starting born in Egypt. He starts building madrasas in Egypt, the famous madrasas, which built Salahiyya and many, many madrasas. And again, it shows that he was a champion of the Sunni revival. So in the way that Nur ad-Din was building madrasas in Syria, Salah ad-Din starts building madrasas in Egypt. And on a side note, it's important to just point out that a lot of the madrasas were built by the female members of Salah ad-Din's family, patrons. So this was not an exclusive thing or just of a man. A lot of women were patrons of madrasas. And again, interestingly enough, it was the madrasas where the money was going, not in mosques and other things. There was a feeling that madrasas had to be built. And of course, it was also important because Salah ad-Din needed people to run the country for him. Did he trust the people in Egypt? No, he did not trust them. He made it very clear he did not trust them. And the first thing he does is he
So Qadi al-Fadl was an exception.
Qadi al-Fadl was an exception, but he did not trust the others. And he immediately started requesting people to come from the Nizamiyya and from the east to come to Egypt. Famous people, there's a very famous man called Khabushani and other Shuyukh who come. And they are the ones who are put in positions of madrasas. He wanted to stamp Sunni madrasa imperature on Egypt. And he could not trust, because there were not enough Sunni madrasa people coming out of Egypt, because there was no legacy. There was no history of that. So you see a flow of people coming, like Ibn Abi Asrun, Khabushani and others, who start moving from Syria and from further east to Egypt and being given professorships and positions of learning. And these were people who then became the chief judges, the chief of justice and so forth of Salah ad-Din. And he starts building his little Sunni cadre of people who he can rely on with his family. As I mentioned, they tried to kill him a couple of times. There's a lot of attempts to do that. All the time he's got his eye on the Crusaders in Jerusalem, and all the time he's trying to pay homage, but in a very distant way, to Nur ad-Din and keeping Nur ad-Din happy. And the situation remains like this when suddenly, of course, Nur ad-Din dies. And overnight, the whole jigsaw starts again.
That's a series of convenient deaths.
He had a lot of Shirku, Al-Adid.
It's as if all those people are dying at the right time.
Well, this is a sign
for the interest of one person to emerge.
Which you could see as an auspicious sign, or as a man's rise to power.
No, I'm asking you as an historian.
Yeah, I know. I think it's just strange, because not only that, Nur ad-Din's son dies later, and it continues.
What was the name of Nur ad-Din's son?
Nur ad-Din's son was interesting, because as soon as Nur ad-Din dies, you have this power struggle. Because suddenly, Amalric, when he hears that Nur ad-Din's son when Nur ad-Din has died, gets off his horse and thinks this is it. Because at that point, the pincer movement was complete. Nur ad-Din was in Syria. Egypt was under his control. The Latin kingdom could not move anymore, could not maneuver. As soon as Nur ad-Din dies, there's an opening. And the focus then is to snatch Nur ad-Din's son, to take him up to Aleppo and try to break this link between Damascus and Aleppo.
Who attempted to do that?
There was a lot of tension between Aleppo and Damascus in any case, and also Aleppo was aided by the Franks, by the Christians. They wanted to break that Damascus-Aleppo. They had to break it, because that was suffocating the Latin kingdom. So Nur ad-Din's son is taken up to Aleppo, he's paraded and so forth, and all eyes are on Salah ad-Din. What's he going to do? Nur ad-Din's son is alive. Nur ad-Din is the successor Nur ad-Din's son is the successor. What will Salah ad-Din do? Salah ad-Din was a Kurd. The Zengi family and the Zengi warlords often called him a dog, Salah ad-Din, a dog that barked against his master. If Salah ad-Din...
Is that something they actually said? Or is it an urban legend?
No, it's in Ibn al-Athir. It's a dog that barked against his master. Because he was a Kurd would he go against Nur ad-Din's son? Now, on the one hand, Syria was fragmenting very quickly. Suddenly, Damascus and Aleppo were no longer under the rule of one person. Egypt, Salah ad-Din could have remained in Egypt and would have ruled Egypt, and he would have continued ruling Egypt like many people have ruled Egypt before. But the real battlefield was in Syria. It was not in Egypt. Was Salah ad-Din ambitious enough to move into Syria, try to control Syria, and keep his power in Egypt and complete what Nur ad-Din had started to do? And in many ways, Nur ad-Din and Salah ad-Din it was the same struggle. And certainly, had Nur ad-Din not died, then the outcome of today's podcast would be Nur ad-Din, not Salah ad-Din. We'd be talking about Nur ad-Din. He would have been the great hero who achieved that. Salah ad-Din, in a way, achieved what Nur ad-Din had started, except that they were different people. And Salah ad-Din had qualities that Nur ad-Din didn't have, and Nur ad-Din had qualities Salah ad-Din did not have. But the next chapter, if one can call it, is Salah ad-Din's move into Syria. He decides he has to control Syria. And he makes a lot of enemies because he's seen as an upstart, no legitimacy, So we get all these letters being written to the Abbasid Caliph, in which Salah ad-Din says, if you want me to capture Jerusalem, if you want me to restore these Muslim lands, I need to control Syria. So this was the kind of constant dialogue that was taking place. My legitimacy comes from the results I will achieve in controlling these Muslim lands, but I cannot do that until I control that. Don't forget, Salah ad-Din knew Damascus extremely well. He'd grown up there. So to him, he was not going to a land which was different. He never liked Egypt, Salah ad-Din, initially. But he grew to love it. And there's a beautiful moment where he's described sitting on the banks of the Nile with his advisors and family. And the breeze of the Nile was coming, and they're talking about Egypt and all that. And this was the last time he went to Egypt, because afterwards he never came back to Egypt. He remained in Syria. So he had a great love. He eventually ended up, realizing the power was Egypt. And he left the ruling of Egypt to his brother, Malik al-Adil, who continued ruling Egypt. And Salah ad-Din moves into Syria. He moves with Qadi al-Fadil and his camp. And the next thing is how he manages to control Damascus. Damascus surrenders to Salah ad-Din in the same way that Najm ad-Din, Salah ad-Din's father, had won it over. Salah ad-Din wins Damascus over through persuasion, through cajoling, probably through bribing a few people as well. That was the natural thing, because we get another example of a Qadi al-Fadil who says, he says to Salah ad-Din, or, and they're trying to figure out how much money you need to win over Damascus. Who do you pay off? And it's a very realpolitik situation, but Damascus opens its gates to Salah ad-Din. And then the next chapter in this whole episode is Salah ad-Din trying to establish his authority in Syria while maintaining his power base in Egypt and moving north to control Aleppo. And then another convenient death. Nur ad-Din's son dies. And the next power struggle is whether Salah ad-Din can capture Aleppo. Extremely important, he does that without shedding of blood. If he went to war against them and he fought them and there was a shedding of blood,
then he would not be able
he would lose his
to
legitimacy.
unite. Yes.
He'd lose his legitimacy. He was Nur ad-Din's successor. So he had to capture it with that elegance and that lack of shedding of blood. And he was so careful not to. Of course, the Christians would not going to allow this happen. The Pope in Aleppo would not going to this happen. And we get this very interesting interlude where the assassins come into the story. And there's 2 attempts on Salah ad-Din's life. And they hired the assassins to kill Salah ad-Din on one occasion.
The assassins.
Hashashin, the assassins.
Yeah. Actually, that's the other branch of the...
Yes, absolutely. Of the Ismaili.
Of the Ismaili family. Al-Nazariyin. So that is the continuation.
I'm not an expert in this.
To the Fatimid family today.
I'm sure. I really have no idea. I'm sorry, I apologize. But, and they tried to kill Salah ad-Din on several occasions, though at one point, the daggers cuts his cheek.
But why would the assassins, because he's the one who ended the Fatimid rule in Egypt, would that be the reason?
I think partly because they were probably either paid off or because they did not want a strong man in Syria, because they preferred to have fragmented Syria. Partly because they're in alliance with the Christians who did not want a powerful ruler in Syria. And largely because there was a great benefit in having Damascus and Aleppo not united. So, so in the way that Nur ad-Din worked north to south, initially through Ahmad ad-Din Zengi in Mosul, then Aleppo, then Damascus, then Egypt, Salah ad-Din had did the reverse. He had to start from Egypt and had to go back and unite. And he did that. He was successful. It took him many years to slowly, painstakingly negotiate with each city. So Aleppo finally opens its gates. He goes back, tries going to Mosul. He falls seriously ill. At one point, he is on death's door. And throughout all this period of time, while he's negotiating, he's doing truces with the Christian Franks. And people are saying to him, but you're supposed to be fighting the jihad. And this is where the inner tension starts appearing. Where is the Salah ad-Din that's going to fight? Why you claim you want legitimacy and your legitimacy will lead you to do this. And yet you're spending your time squabbling and arguing and trying to fight and trying to win over these Islamic cities. And his argument is that I cannot do this until or unless I finish this whole
unification
process. And there's a very moment when he fell seriously ill in the north of Syria, in Iraq, and Al-Qadi al-Fadl is with him. And again, this is the point where Qadi al-Fadl literally holds his hand, and he says, you've got to vow that if Allah makes you recover from this illness, He will turn your attention on Jerusalem. And eventually, all the major cities in Syria pay homage to Salah ad-Din. What's interesting about it is that, and this is where really his greatness starts appearing, because what's really interesting about him is that he could not force any of these cities to send out men to support him. He needed an army from all these places to confront. He could not force them militarily to do so.
So Salah ad-Din's strategy was to make sure that he never sheds blood within the Muslims, to make sure that he does not lose his legitimacy, and to make sure that he unifies all of those scattered cities before he turns his attention.
Yes.
With that scene with him dying and with Al-Qadi al-Fadl, and he vows that if God saves him, he's going to turn his attention to the fight for Jerusalem.
Again, one reads history back to front. Was Salah ad-Din sincere about fighting the Crusaders, or was he more interested in developing a whole empire for himself? Those who criticize him say that his priority was to establish his dynasty and his family in these places, and that he was avoiding any conflict, and they point to the truces. Of course, those who champion Salah ad-Din would say that he knew the strengths and weaknesses more than anyone, and he was simply following in what Nur-ad-Din had achieved. And of course, what Salah ad-Din was trying to achieve was far harder than what Nur-ad-Din achieved, because the stakes were much higher against him, because he was constantly fighting this argument that he was somehow focusing on his personal aggrandizement rather than on fighting the jihad as such. But eventually he succeeds in pacifying, and if one can use that word, Syria, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. And there's so many stories that take place at that time. The Latin kingdom, Amalric himself dies as well,
conveniently.
And even more conveniently, is succeeded by a young man, Baldwin, who turns out to have leprosy, the leper king, and who was a remarkable man. I mean, when I was writing on Salah ad-Din, you have to admire Baldwin, the courage and the fortitude of fighting. He was the one man who inflicted defeat on Salah ad-Din in battle, and the courage he had to defend his kingdom. But of course, you couldn't survive long. And after that, there's a whole struggle for legitimacy in the kingdom of Jerusalem, and the running out of men, and it's becoming more difficult. And the details are not that important, because the strategic position was, if one can sum it on the eve of the battle, was a united Muslim, provinces, or don't call them countries, plus this constant madrasa building, which kept producing scholars who are now taking positions in government administration and who are being almost rubber stamped with a certain Sunni knowledge. And you have to see it as both. And as we mentioned in our earlier discussion, this was happening independently of the Crusaders' movements, but for sure it helped create an awareness of that, because a scholar who came from Baghdad, as I said, to teach in Egypt would help create this homogeneity of an Islamic world, as opposed to people who did not travel. So there was definitely a sense of an ummah, of an Islamic world, of a struggle that had to happen. And it was there, the ulama, these people, the scholars of madrasas, who were constantly urging Salah ad-Din to fight the jihad. Now, one can argue that Salah ad-Din would have fought anyway. One could have said he was maybe more reluctant than he should have been. All this is nitpicking on somebody's greatness. But there's no doubt that whispering to him on his shoulder were the scholars and the ulama who were urging him, you've got to fight the holy war.
Including القاضي
including al-Qadi al-Fadl, who was probably more, cynical and realpolitik about it, because he probably realized how difficult it was. And
he was not the production of the Nizamiyya.
No, because he was a production of the Fatimid bureaucracy. He did not go to madrasa, although he set up many madrasas. But the other people, Ahmad al-Din Isfahani and Bahaddin al-Shaddad, who are the three people who really are the, secretaries of Salah ad-Din. The other two were definitely from the Nizamiyya madrasa. But what's interesting about this whole issue was that, as I said earlier, Salah ad-Din had no power over these cities, other than a kind of authority which came from a certain legitimacy that he's going to fight and reconquer. He could not force them to send men. He just couldn't. And yet, they sent the men. And here we start beginning to see and appreciate the genius and the greatness of Salah ad-Din. Why would they would call him a Kurdish dog, they would insult him, and yet they would send men. Which means they must have seen that he himself, had great honor. They could see he was not a man who was corrupt. He was a man who was extremely virtuous. A man who, there was a very famous Latin Christian historian called William of Tyre, a contemporary, who recognized Salah ad-Din from a young man and actually writes, "This man is unlike the others. He cannot be bought." And Salah ad-Din, to a large extent, was very straight. He just went straight down the middle. And because that age was one of incredible cynicism and, conspiracy theories and machinations, Salah ad-Din's directness almost could not be understood. He's a man who spoke the truth, and he said, "I'm going to do this." And he went straight down the middle. And people would have recognized that. They may not have liked him. They may have thought, what's this Kurdish man? Why is he ruling? Why should I not? I, the son of so-and-so.
Are you talking about the Zenki family?
The Zenki, absolutely.
And the
families.
Turkish
absolutely.
aristocracy?
Why would they even send troops to this Kurd? They sent troops. They would have sent that there was a greatest purpose to this man. There was a greater vision to this man. There would have been a sense of honor, a sense of piety, a sense of greatness. Because he had no military power to force them to send. And this gets more and more, later on in the story. Eventually, he gathers his whole army. He has his two generals. He has his nephew, a man called Taqiyuddin, and other man called Kukbari, who are his two generals. He gets an army. It's a long story. The Christians make a lot of mistakes tactically and strategically. And finally, in that very famous Battle of Hattin in 1187, in one day, he destroys the Christian kingdoms. And there's a complete collapse and complete destruction of the Frankish army. And this was the triumph of Salah ad-Din, followed immediately by the surrender of most of the Islamic cities on the coast, apart from,
most of the
the Christian coastal cities. And finally he captures Jerusalem a few months later. And he could have said, and this is what he doesn't say it, but it's clear, now this is the legitimacy that I've been promising you. He writes to the Caliph. He's always writing the Caliph. There's always tension between him and the Abbasid Caliph, because he's saying to him, send me more money, send me this, send me the help. Look, I'm doing the fighting for you. You're sitting in Baghdad. There's always this kind of politics that's taking place between them. But once he captures Jerusalem, there's no dispute anymore. Finally, he's captured Jerusalem. He promised, if you gave me time to sort out Syria, I would capture Jerusalem. He gave his word, and he delivered. And his greatness, of course, was cemented in that capture. What I said earlier was that his captured Jerusalem, though extremely important and symbolically of huge value to the Muslim world, was, if one could say, inevitable once he secured Egypt and Syria. Because if not Salah ad-Din, then somebody else, as long as they had followed the same road map, would have done it. This is the way Jerusalem would be captured. Jerusalem, don't forget, symbolically of huge importance, but militarily and strategically of very little importance. What would have been a catastrophe for the Muslims is if Aleppo or Damascus or Cairo fell. And we noticed that early on with the Fatimids. But for Jerusalem to fall, Jerusalem was symbolically an important city, but it did not have the power and the wealth and the might of, let's say, Damascus or Aleppo. These were the real heartbeat of the Islamic world. But if the Damascus and Aleppo and Mosul and Egypt were in the hands of one person, and if that person managed to get the armies in one place, then Jerusalem would fall. Because Jerusalem cannot rely on men coming from the West all the time to save it. But of course, as soon as Jerusalem fell, huge uproar in Europe. And the Europeans had to send a crusade, and they actually had a tax in England called the Salahuddin tax to raise money. And they
say that again.
Salahuddin, there's a tax
in
England called the Salahuddin tax, the Saladin tithe. And it was to raise money to go recapture Jerusalem. And they taxed beer in this country. And you can imagine what the English would have thought about that. They had to raise money. And of course,
that's what financed
the Third Crusade. It was the Third Crusade.
Okay.
And of course, this was the crusade of, Frederick Barbarossa, Richard I, of Richard Coeur de Lion, Richard the Lionheart, and they were determined to capture Jerusalem. And as soon as Salah ad-Din captured Jerusalem, he knew that he's going to unleash this whole, they're not going to take it quietly. Of course, they're not going to take it quietly. And then we have this final chapter in his life. And one has to remember that Richard and Salah ad-Din, who, as I said, never actually met, ever came close to meeting, really in the last 3-4 years of Salah ad-Din's life. So again, because of the Crusader obsession, the Western obsession with the Crusades, we always assume that they must have had a long enmity and they must have long time and been fighting. But in fact, the Third Crusade does not come till much later in Salah ad-Din's life. And there's a huge onslaught, and, Richard was a formidable military commander. And of course, he lands there with his army. He massacres Acre, upon the famous siege where he kills 3,000 people. 3,000 Muslim, and terrible siege that takes place. And then he starts marching down the coast. And Salah ad-Din is unable to stop him. He sends armies, he harasses him. There's a war of attrition that takes place. And Salah ad-Din is desperate because by then, you're talking 1189. You're talking about years and years of fighting. The Muslim army was exhausted. The Muslim army was a seasonal army. This was not a full-time army. They would go off because they were farmers often to do their harvest and then come back. So it was a seasonal campaign. In winters, the army would disband. And he would ask Mosul, send me more men. He'd ask, send me more men. I need more men. He would plead with Egypt, send me more men, until Egypt itself was exhausted by sending men. Because he had to keep an army, a standing army, to fight Richard. And Richard was indomitable, he was formidable, and he was determined to capture Jerusalem. And Salah ad-Din was helpless in stopping him from capturing Jerusalem. So the armies would come, they kept coming further south and south and south, until came to this critical point where Salah ad-Din had to make a strategic decision. He knew he could not fight Richard anymore. He didn't have the force to fight Richard. Even his nephew, Salah ad-Din's nephew Taqiyuddin, a man who fought with him at Hittin, at one point actually abandoned Salah ad-Din because he actually said to him, I can't take this anymore. This is jihad all the time. I need to go off and have my own land and my own dynasty and my own that. And of course, Taqiyuddin dies and Salah ad-Din is heartbroken by that. So even the people around him were saying, we can't endure this pressure that you're putting us under. And there comes a point where Salah ad-Din has to make this very important strategic decision. Does he retreat to Egypt, knowing that Richard will never get to him in Egypt because the supply line chains are Richard is not interested. He cannot capture Egypt. It's far too big. And he goes back to Egypt and he reinforces Egypt. And so doing, he abandons Jerusalem. Or does he defend Jerusalem even though he knows he cannot defend Jerusalem anymore? And his greatness, again, in a long list of greatnesses, was not so much his capture of Jerusalem, but his defense of Jerusalem. He vowed that he would rather die than surrender Jerusalem. And suddenly this man who is talking about I will die rather than surrender Jerusalem is a man in his fullness. He's no longer the young man who did not want to go to Egypt. He's not the young man who spent his time, campaigning in the south and then the north of Syria, not picking fights, making truces. This is a man who was being tested to the ultimate limit and who vowed that he would not give up Jerusalem. So he tore down the walls of Ascalon because he could not allow Richard to capture Ascalon. Ascalon was in a way the gateway to Egypt, to Gaza. And he retreats to Jerusalem with a few men he had left. By that time, most of his army had disbanded. It was winter. It was bitterly cold. And there's a beautiful scene described by Ibn Shaddad where he's sitting in his court in Jerusalem. And around him are the people, his closest confidants. And Ibn Shaddad says they were sitting there so quietly that birds could have perched on their heads. And then Salah ad-Din speaks and he says, I am prepared to die here. I will not leave Jerusalem and I will fight to the death in Jerusalem. I will not give up Jerusalem. And very interestingly, the people around him support him, including people who were campaigning against him in his early life, people who had insulted him. And suddenly we see a completely different image of Salah ad-Din, people, a really pure, honorable person. And even those people who had bitterly fought against him, and from the time when he was vizier in Egypt, now stood up and said, we will also fight and die with you in Jerusalem. So here's a man who had almost transcended any of the egos of the world and the ambition and so forth, and who realized he could not defeat Richard. So they poison the wells and they wait for this final conflict. And Richard was right on the gates of Jerusalem, and really nothing could stop him from capturing Jerusalem. And Salah ad-Din knew that he'd have to fight to the death to keep Jerusalem. And history turns. Richard never captures Jerusalem. At the last minute, Richard pulls away and retreats and goes back.
Why?
Egypt. Syria. What I said earlier. People in Richard's camp told him, okay, fine. You'll capture Jerusalem. Then what? You can't stay here. You have to go back to England. Don't forget, Richard's brother John was causing problems. As soon as you go back, the Muslims are going to capture Jerusalem again. They did not have the power and the number of men and the supply lines
to compete with Egypt.
Or compete with, or Aleppo or Damascus. They could not control the Muslim world. As I said, they never had the ability to control the Muslim world. Fine, capture Jerusalem now. In a couple of years, it will be back in the Muslim hands. He will cause a massacre, he'll cause bloodshed, Salah ad-Din will fight to the end. What is the point? So you have this bravado where Richard writes a letter to Salah ad-Din and says, I'm going back to England, but I'll be back to fight and stuff. I will capture you. And Salah ad-Din writes back, says, yes, I'm sure you'll be back and I'll be waiting for you. And there's this whole kind of charade of trying to save honor on both sides. But again, it goes back to the point that as long as Egypt was held, as long as he held the main cities of Syria and Egypt, then Jerusalem could come and go. But Richard was powerless to gain this foothold in the Muslim hinterland, which would have allowed him to really establish a legacy of a Christian presence.
It was always this equation of if you have the Levant and Egypt unified, that it was just being
This
impossible.
is a pattern that appears again and again and again. And it's proven conclusively with Salah ad-Din and Nur-ad-Din that the unified Egypt and Syria is partly...
When you say Syria, you mean the Levant, the greater Syria.
Of course. And it's also it's not just a physical and geographical one, but it's also an ideological one, which is under Sunni Islamic auspices. And this is where it was important that, there were Shia in Aleppo. There were Shia who fought for Salah ad-Din, not the Ismailis, other Shias. But ultimately, this was a Sunni Muslim stronghold. And this is a lesson that one, can apply to anything and all the time.
The Mamluks are the one that really maintained that unification between the Levant and Egypt for the longest time.
Even today, we're almost the anniversary of the 73 war, and you can see that this is exactly what happens when Egypt and Syria work together. There's something, this is the lesson that one learns again and again and again. So Richard retreats, and Salah ad-Din is broken. He's a broken man by then. He's not a young old man. He dies in his 50s, and he's a broken man by the huge pressure and exhaustion. And one can only imagine the amount of pressure and that he must have been under. The whole Muslim world looking at him trying to fight to the end, hold Jerusalem. And he spent some time in Damascus afterwards. He falls ill, and he passes away, as I said, with Al-Qadi al-Fadl next to him. And he dies a very beautiful, beautiful death, with the Quran being recited in a very calm way. And as soon as he dies, the Muslim world suddenly realizes what they've lost. As long as he was alive, this is a man who, through his humility, his perseverance, his piety, sense of humor, through a calmness he had. Nur ad-Din was a man of great austerity, of great religion, of great rigor. Ahmad ad-Din Zengi we've spoken about. But Salah ad-Din had a calmness and a dignity and a kindness which won people over. And it's almost impossible as a historian, when you only have the sources in front of you, to really understand the person. You can only understand the person when you see how people reacted when that person died. And there's this wave of grief and sadness that spread across the Muslim world when they heard that Salah ad-Din had died. And he had said to Al-Qadi al-Fadl or Ibn Shaddad, as long as I'm alive, the center will hold. So he must have realized at one point, or, that it required this superhuman strength for him to achieve what he did achieve. If we were to sum up and look at his achievements and his greatness, we've spoken about Jerusalem, we've spoken about his personal qualities, his introduction of Sunni Islam through madrasas into Egypt, and his bringing of Egypt into the Sunni fold is without doubt his greatest achievement, because that in a way led to all the other achievements. Without that, this could not have happened. He was also what I call a extremely loyal child of the Sunni revival. He was not a great intellectual, Salah ad-Din. He was not a man who was immersed himself in his books. I think, I can't remember, I think it's Ibn Shaddad or Isfahani who said that he knew enough of the Aqidah to get by. So he probably just knew enough to do it. But he always had the Quran. He had a lot of hadith recited. He had the Quran recited with him all the time. He had one of his secretaries to write down all the days that he did not fast because he was ill or traveling. This was all noted down. He was a man of great, great humility and great piety. And he was a very loyal follower of the Sunni revival without fully understanding it. He was not a Ghazali in that sense. He was not a Nizam al-Mulk in that sense. But by building madrasas, by championing it, by constantly strengthening its pillars, he achieved what really a few years earlier would have been almost impossible. And we only have to remember that it was only 88 years between the capture of Jerusalem in 1098 and the recovery of Jerusalem in 1187. And in those periods, that huge revolution that took place in the Islamic world, which was, as I said, independent of the Crusaders, which is the madrasa building, the Sunni revival, the emergence of this man who was an outsider, occurred in a world dominated by Turks. A man who was not a great military general, I would say. He had great military people around him, but he was a cautious man. But a man who somehow transcended other people through his virtue, his piety, his sense of honor, his courage,
his ability to work with others,
diplomacy, wisdom, and I think above all honesty, so that people who fundamentally disliked him supported him. And that is a sign of greatness, that they could recognize that there was something which went beyond ambitions and ego. He had no money. So why was he in power if he did not own? It was obvious that this was not a man who was accumulating power and wealth for himself. And that is the greatness of Salah ad-Din. Unfortunately, we live in an age where there are people currently who are criticizing Salah ad-Din a lot. One or two people who told them not mention, who come out on occasionally on television, on media, who find a fault in Salah ad-Din, who feel that, are nitpicking. And I think these are just people who are blind to his greatness.
I always had a question. His father,
Who?
Najmuddin Ayyub, asked to be buried in the Holy Land, I think in Mecca or Medina. Yeah. And Salah ad-Din got that done for him after his death. And he was eventually buried in Medina. Why didn't Salah ad-Din ask to be buried in Jerusalem?
After the fall of Jerusalem, Salah ad-Din went to Jerusalem, of course. There's this very famous...
You mean after the liberation of Jerusalem?
Yes, after the liberation, captured Jerusalem, he went to it, of course. There's a very famous scene, which is the first Friday prayer after, when everybody turned up. All the great and good of the Muslim world was, put on their latest clean robes and they went out. And there's this whole discussion of who he's going to choose. Salah ad-Din would choose to give the khutbah. He chose a man called Muhyiddin ibn Zaki, and then he asked for another man called Zainuddin ibn Najah to give a kind of words. And he was there, and they say his face was beaming. But then he does leave Jerusalem. I could be wrong. I can't remember if he ever went back to Jerusalem or not, because he was on campaign with Richard all that time afterwards. An interesting question is why he never went back to Egypt. He remained in Damascus. Don't forget, he grew up in Damascus. He endured the Second Crusade in Damascus. He would have loved and known Damascus, with all his heart. And he was buried in Damascus in the same way that Baybars was buried in Damascus as well. So the great love for Sham, Balad Sham, I don't know. I don't know why he... Najmuddin, of course, the love of the Prophet. I mean, one cannot, it's a great honor to be able to be buried there. And he was a remarkable man, Najmuddin Ayyub. I don't think he gets the credit, perhaps, because there isn't enough in the sources about him. He's always seen as the father of Salah ad-Din, because we know what happens. So, if one were to sum up, we talk about a personality who remains in history so established, so well known, so famous. And in a way, his name has withstood the test of time. I mentioned that there are people who are critical of Salah ad-Din. I think these are baseless criticisms. I think that in a way it shows how small they are rather than how, great Salah ad-Din is. I think there's nothing wrong with criticizing Salah ad-Din because he was just a human being who made many mistakes, who had a lot of faults, but he also had enormous amount of qualities, and he led by example. But I think the lesson we have to learn, if one can, sum up, is that we go back to this earlier point of today's generation saying, oh, we need another Salah ad-Din. Or, if only there was a Salah ad-Din, if Salah ad-Din could come, he would fix this and he'd do that. And I repeat what I said earlier. Salah ad-Din, without doubt, espoused profound personal qualities. But Salah ad-Din was great because he lived in an age of greatness. The age of madrasas, the age of learning, the age of tremendous confidence in oneself. The Muslims in the early years of the Crusades were losing battle after battle. They lost Jerusalem. They lost almost every conflict they fought. But at no point did they ever lose their confidence in themselves. You have the writings of people like Osama ibn Munkid, who wrote a diary, memoirs, and you could see there was a huge flowering. I haven't mentioned another great man who lived at that period, a man called Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, the great Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, one of the greatest shuyukh in Islam, who was living in Baghdad. He never met with Salah ad-Din, but many of the people around Salah ad-Din, many of them were Wafaq ad-Din ibn Qudama, Ibn Abi Asrun. Many of them were actually disciples of al-Jilani. So you have this incredible flowering where you have Ghazali and Abdul Qadir al-Jilani all within 50 years of each other. You have numerous other writers and scholars and thinkers coming out. This was an Islam, a civilization which was being defeated on the military field, but was flourishing in its self-confidence and knowledge and depth of intelligence. And it was a great age. And Salah ad-Din was a great leader who came to lead these great men. So today, to talk about the individual personality of one person and to ignore the age in which we live means that Salah ad-Din will never be able to come back. And if he did come back, he would not be able to succeed because the age itself is not based on the principles that it should be based on, which is learning and wisdom and education and self-sacrifice and returning to the principles of, Islamic beliefs and so forth. So the age of Salah ad-Din was a great age. Nuruddin was a great man. We've spoken about other people. And it's a testimony to Salah ad-Din that in that great age, he managed to rise to the top. But the focus on Salah ad-Din as one person, as a personality, as a cult hero, is extremely self-defeating today. We need to understand the principles that we spoke about, whether it's the madrasa building or the building of knowledge, the contribution that other thinkers have made.
The institutionalization that resulted in the production of someone like Salah ad-Din.
Exactly. It resulted and gave a society of scholars and ulama who managed to guide Salah ad-Din to lead them. You can have all the institutions in the world, but unless you had a charismatic leader, it would not work. But if you had a charismatic leader with no institutions, it's going to end up in disaster. And I think this is the main lesson that Salah ad-Din has taught us.
It's a chain of events that probably starts with Nizam al-Mulk and his idea of the institutionalization of the madrasas. The role that played.
It had to start somewhere, whether it's Nizam al-Mulk or whether Nizam al-Mulk himself was inspired by something, but there's definitely a turning point. But I think the important point to make is that it was independent of any reaction to the West. We need to stop thinking about the Muslims responding to the Crusades or to the West, the counter-crusade, all this narrative that somehow the Muslims were disorganized and that after a period of the time they got their act together, which is true to an extent. But to understand the period in a much more profound manner, we have to understand that the Nizam al-Mulk and Ghazali and the Qadir Jilani and the Madrasa building and all these great scholars were independent of what was happening with the Crusades. They just happened to be coincidental. And in fact, that coincidental nature of it was a great tremendous support and blessing for Islam because it came to Islam's rescue. But it was not because of the Crusades. Muslims do not need the Crusades to find inner strength and inner wisdom and inner fortitude. I repeat, and you finish with what I started off saying, that the Crusades were more or less a Western obsession, and I think we need to stop looking at that, and we need to see Salah ad-Din as an Islamic leader within an Islamic milieu. And I think by doing that, by removing the myths and legends, which frankly add color to the story. They're wonderful stories, and they're, most of them are true, some are not, some are apocryphal. But the Salah ad-Din that I write about is a really legacy of something which is very, very profound. And I think the lessons of that profound nature are far more enduring than the charismatic qualities of a remarkable man.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Rahman.
Pleasure. Always a pleasure.
I don't think I could have found a better summary or a better closure for that episode. ما أعتقدش إن كان ممكن ألاقي طريقة أفضل من كده إن أنا أنهي بيها الحلقة عن الكلام اللي قاله عبد الرحمن عن مغزى القصة بتاعت صلاح الدين والفترة اللي كان عايش فيها على الواقع بتاعنا النهاردة وعلى التحديات اللي احنا بنمر بيها النهاردة وما أشبه اليوم بالبارحة. كتير من الظروف اللي بنعدي بيها النهاردة والأحوال السياسية اللي حوالينا بتفكرنا بالتحديات اللي الناس دي مرت بيها. وصلاح الدين ما كانش حاجة منفردة، أو هو ما كانش عنده قدرات خيالية هي اللي خلته يقدر إن هو يحقق اللي حققه. صلاح الدين كان في إطار في ناس كتير كانت بتشتغل بضمير وبمجهود، قدر إن هو يشتغل مع الآخرين، ما يشتغلش لوحده، قدر إن هو بالدبلوماسية ساعات، بالحرب ساعات، إن هو يوحد مصر والشام، ويقدر إن هو يوصل في الآخر تحرير القدس. أعتقد الدرس الأساسي من الفترة اللي الناس دي مرت بيها، ومن كل العظماء دول، من أول نظام الملك اللي جه قبل صلاح الدين بوقت كبير، بس جزء من شغله هو اللي ساهم مش بس في وجود صلاح الدين نفسه، لكن وجود الناس اللي حواليه، اللي هي في الآخر جزء من المجهود اللي اتعمل أو اللي اتحط علشان القضاء على الممالك الاستعمارية الصليبية ساعتها. يعني أشكرك تاني يا عبد الرحمن على كل الوقت وكل الكلام كل الحكايات اللي انت حكيتها لنا النهاردة.
Thank you.
وأتمنى ان احنا نقابلك مرة تانية
إن شاء الله.
إن شاء الله.
Thank you so much.
شكرا.